Manhattan is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City and one of the smallest and most densely populated of the United States. And now the sky above him was painted a poisonous purple color, reflected in the eyes of players ready for anything. Knights, warriors, magicians. The system's preventive measures against lowering the rating had begun. The mission type is defense. The system summoned the doomsday monster, Behemoth, whose huge claws tore right through the rift in the sky. The man, dressed in ordinary city clothes, clutched the sword uncertainly and looked up with his mouth slightly open. Behind him, apparently another magician, screamed at the top of his lungs. The first one's eyelids trembled with horror. He passionately wished that what he saw was just a dream. The system ordered to defeat Begatome before it destroyed the world, by which time the monster had already made its way through the rift. A huge humanoid head with horns was trying to decide whose limbs to tear off first. The next second, Behemoth opened his mouth like the gates of hell, letting out a deafening bestial squeal while his eyes burned with a devilish fire. The man gestured for the warriors to stop, demanding that they maintain formation. Otherwise, they would lose, and the price for this would be the end of the world. An unimaginable monster emerged from the rift and walked freely through the wide streets of the city, waving its paws through the air. A magical blue flame blazed near its ugly head. BattleNet started in 2010. At first, it was a simple competitive game between nations, but everything changed with the opening of the Space League in 2022. Then, there was a battle for survival against other space creatures. The representatives of the Earth, people, were rapidly losing and dying in whole cities at once. Today, in the year 2023, there are only 10 nations left on Earth, which puts the planet in danger of destruction. The hippopotamus suddenly stopped right in the middle of the road, straightened up and opened its mouth, inside which a deadly funnel appeared. The monster bent its long knees and leaned forward, releasing a tangible ultrasound from its throat that struck all people like waves of radiation, instantly attacking every cell of the body. Something quickly slid through the air, and a man, looking like an ordinary office worker, froze above Behemoth's huge head. The stranger drew his dark eyebrows together, shaking his head to brush unruly strands of hair from his face. A few seconds later, he darted even higher like lightning, and the entire space around him was filled with a bright white light, framed by purple flashes. Every emotion in the human's eyes disappeared as the boy rushed straight down, stretching out the palm of one hand in front of him and clenching the other into a fist, as if he was preparing to hit the monster. The Behemoth wasn't going to give up that easily, so while the guy was flying down, the spawn's magical flame completely burned one of his arms up to the shoulder, leaving a blurry stump. As soon as the stranger touched the Behemoth's flesh, it sank into the ground with the enormous force of a moving electric drill, destroying the asphalt. A strong wind arose, which almost blew away the warriors' team. They could barely stand on their feet, covering their faces from the flying dust. The man fell to the ground as the asphalt began to crumble right under his feet. Opening his eyes, he was stunned by what he saw. The system was lit up with a sign: Earth, USA, mission accomplished. That same guy was standing on Behemoth's corpse. The man whispered under his breath, thinking that the stranger was a combat priest and possessed incredible strength for his class. Son Jihan, a member of the America First Guild and the 7th-ranked player in the world, is an unremarkable-looking young man with eyes that are keenly focused on everything around him. Son's attention was drawn to a commanding voice, amplified 100-fold, coming from the direction of a tall skyscraper. It said that his beloved country America had won once again. The speaker spoke with a strange grin on his lips and said that this historical moment would remain in the memory of all citizens and the Universal Master. He was talking about himself, Baron Williams, the head of the America First Guild, the #1 player in the world rankings. Tall, broad-shouldered, blonde, blue-eyed, confident, and dressed in a snow-white suit and guild uniform. There was a crowd standing behind him. They gasped, demanding that the priestess, who had suddenly descended down to Jihan, return immediately. Baron waved his hand. The man next to him was worried that the Behemoth's energy was still raging on the surface, but the leader was confident in the girl's strength. He narrowed his eyes as he looked down at the body of the huge dead monster. The Behemoth was indeed powerful. The corpse emanated such energy that it could knock out most of the players. Those who were close to it could not rise from their knees and desperately tried to cough. Jihan manages to stay next to him despite his injury. However, the priestess has already descended to the ground. Sophia, a member of America First and the 3rd-ranked player in the guild, a young maiden in a floor-length robe with long blonde hair, screamed in fear when she saw Son. Realizing this, she pointed her staff at the guy, using a restoration spell, from which soft green healing energy immediately gushed out. Seeing the young man wince, the priestess hastened to remind him of the pain caused by the behemoth's energy, so the hero would have to endure it a little. He clenched his teeth with all his might and just hissed, expressing displeasure. But he had no intention of complaining about the pain. Suddenly, the guild members on the skyscraper balcony became animated, calling for Mr. Baron to look down. A large golden chest appeared in front of Jihan and Sophia, from which a golden glow emanated. The reward for the boss, which the others noticed. The boy clutched the stump of his arm tightly as the guild leader ordered him and the priestess to step aside. The man and his assistants gathered to collect the reward themselves, and immediately raised their hands, glowing with the red energy of collection. The warriors standing below clicked their tongues in irritation, outraged by the impudence of Williams's actions. But they could do nothing. The end of humanity was near, and it was a real danger, so such people were their only hope. The leader and the rest of the guild members descended from the skyscraper's balcony. Baron called on the guild to listen carefully. Those present lined up as he was about to announce the names of those who would receive the awards. Sun exhaled, and Sophia let out a muffled cry when the names of the lucky ones were announced. Priestess number 4 and number 5. The priestess waved her hand towards the guy. Stepping forward, she demanded to wait, because it was he who killed the monster. When asked why Jihan was left without a reward, Baron frowned his bushy eyebrows and pointed his finger rudely at the young man. The dream was not an American. The sentence that was pronounced struck the boy's heart like an arrow, but he did not show that it had in any way hurt his feelings. Blue, piercing eyes pierced the indignant couple. The man stated firmly that citizenship did not make Jihan one of them. He lowered his head, looking back fearlessly. As it turned out, for all his achievements, Sun was now only a useful assistant. The priestess clenched her fists, intending to condemn what was said, but the 7th player twitched his injured shoulder, assuring that everything was fine. Jihan turned on his heels and walked in the opposite direction, throwing out as a parting word that he didn't care, knowing deep down that the guild leader was right. He was just a refugee who fled after losing his homeland, almost the only one who survived and saw the destroyed city with his own eyes. The young man obtained the 4th rank of the nameless divine arts fragments of an unknown ability, reaching 7th place in the world player rankings. But even this did not help Jihan to integrate into society. Others did not recognize him as one of their own and forced him to experience all kinds of discrimination. And it was not these circumstances that worried him more. There was something else that hurt the player to the depths of his soul. He felt incredible guilt for being the only survivor. He wanted to howl from helplessness. Sun sat among the destroyed streets, having climbed right onto the roof of a broken taxi, where just a few weeks ago a random resident was driving somewhere in joyful anticipation. The guy shook his head and, as if coming to his senses, decided to restore his hand with his own energy because the results should come soon. The system sign immediately announced the results of the low-ranking Bronze League task. Task type, defense, conditions met, more than half of the players survived. The USA completed the task. China was among the lucky ones, despite the widespread destruction. Russia, Japan, and other countries failed the mission. The sky turned red as the system listed the destroyed countries on a large 3D globe. People looked up in horror, not believing that only 2 countries out of 10 had completed the task. A red sign threatening dire consequences stated that humanity had lost and had not passed the rating downgrade prevention. There are other players who have not passed the rating downgrade prevention. They will meet the orcs in the final battle during the rating downgrade prevention. The warriors who had been damaged by the behemoth's energy, currently standing next to the guild leader, cried out in dismay upon hearing who they would be fighting. Sophia ran up to Baron, who was starting to get angry, calling on him to bring Jihan back, since they only won the last fight thanks to the fighter. But the man was adamant. He firmly replied that the guild would go into battle without him. The system called for representatives from each planet. The event would soon begin. In the 3-dimensional arena, people were transformed on the opposite side from them, orcs. Williams led the warriors, with the first representative standing behind him. The guild leader couldn't allow an outsider to rise in the rankings at his expense. He spat at the orcs, the vile pigs as the man called them. The monsters were confidently playing with the weapons in their paws. Their powerful, wide bodies were covered in ritual designs, and their small red eyes glowed in the semi-darkness. The priestess, having appeared in the arena, stepped back. The girl's eyebrows shot up indignantly. Were there really only 4 representatives of their people, in addition to the ranker from China? The guild leader's hand clenched into a trembling fist. He convinced himself that everything was fine. They didn't need Song Jihan. The man clenched his teeth and growled fiercely, releasing his inner strength. He was burning, emitting lightning, and believed that he could handle it alone. The first player called for the orcs to attack, and he himself rose up, forming a bright magical flame coming from his solar plexus. He loudly declared that he was a representative of humanity and swung his arm to attack the monsters. Having built up enough rage, Baron roared, his eyes empty, only the seething anger remaining in them. He rushed at the enemy, and the huge orc knocked down the target with a single blow, as if it were a toy airplane. Sophia's mouth opened wide, clutching her staff in her hands. Even the strong-looking player standing in front froze in horror. The rest of the people watching the carnage suddenly gasped, and some covered their mouths with their hands. Jihan jumped off the roof of the taxi, seeing the new sign from the system. His face reflected bewilderment. The orc's blow proved fatal for the guild leader. The system stated that the human representative was dead. The remaining population of the planet, upon reading the inscription, howled in stunned horror and despair, realizing that they were now left without their leader. The monsters did not stop there. The warriors who rushed to avenge the leader fell into a trap. As soon as another orc killed players with his bare hands, the system immediately notified about the death of another human representative. Finding herself on the ground, Sophia begged for mercy as the monster brought his deadly axe down on her. But he seemed not to hear the human voice and only raised his weapon over his head again, intending to thank the people for their weakness. A second. And for humanity, the game is over. It has lost and has been excluded from the Bronze League. There is no lower league. Humanity has been recognized as worthless. It has been excluded from the Space League. A small portal appeared near the foot of one of the last people, a black hole with purple flowers. This is how the deletion that the system had announced began. The portal grew in a matter of seconds, covering the entire area where the men and women were now standing. Jihan stepped back, looking in bewilderment as his entire body was engulfed in thin clots of deadly energy. Now he found himself in pitch darkness and looked up in horror. The end of the world was coming. A portal, a black hole, formed right in the planet. It seemed that the Earth was destroying itself. People were writhing, screaming, calling for help from their loved ones for the last time, and there was no way to refuse or run away from this. In the cycle of deaths, when the human race was being devoured by energy, the star flared up for the last time, and then the removal of humanity was complete. It was unknown how much time had passed, but the system had detected an error, causing some people to remain, and the nameless divine arts were preventing the deletion. That was what Jihan's consciousness heard. That same fragment of an unknown ability, the user must find out the real name after reworking 3 divine secrets for the player. Then he will be able to awaken them. His eyes were closing. He wanted to fall asleep. But right now the system and the higher ones were deciding the fate of the guy who desperately wanted to save and protect his loved ones. The majority voted to have the player return during his first entry into the league. Something seemed to knock the player out of consciousness, and the next second he woke up from loud voices, finding himself sweating, with his heart beating wildly and his breathing quickened. Jihan sat up abruptly and grabbed his head, which was suddenly pierced by thousands of needles. It hurt mercilessly, and several empty bottles of strong alcohol were lined up in a row on the table before his eyes. Gritting his teeth, the boy tried to understand what had happened, because he only remembered reading that he would return during his first entry into the league. Removing his hand from his face, the player looked around in surprise, the pain giving way to bewilderment. He was sitting on a wide sofa in front of a large TV in a spacious room. Suddenly, some cogs in his head started to move, and Jihan shuddered when his hearing focused on the sounds of the street coming from behind the curtained window. The young man ran there and abruptly pulled aside the curtains blocking the view, and then was stunned. A faint note of hope trembled in my soul when it became clear that it was once again 2022, and South Korea still existed with its population, cities, and provinces. Under the windows of Jihan's house, boys played Kings of Swords, fighting with sticks from the trees. A young couple passing by were having fun. The girl was egging the guy on, asking if he would play today too. He chuckled, intending to do it after the training. The player looked at this picture in shock, unshed tears frozen in his eyes. He really had returned. This realization suddenly overwhelmed Jihan with a wave of panic, and he rushed to open the status window. A smile formed on his lips as he saw his name and the second-level designation on the screen, the time when humans first entered the league. It became a little calmer. Adrenaline started running through the blood. The guy had been given a great opportunity. If he uses information from his past life, he can change the future. Jihan slowly turned to the opposite wall, where a large portrait of his family hung. This time, he would protect everyone. Now everything will probably turn out differently, because he himself saw how the game ended and returned. In 2012, people had no idea what was going to happen. Up until that point, Korea was on its own. In the world ranking of players, the top 11 were from here, and among them one was in third place. He was faster than light, more powerful than any lightning bolt, and could dispatch an entire swath of enemies with incredible speed and a single movement. The man had the ability to wield two swords at once. He was the Sword King, Yun Se-jin, and thanks to him, Korea remained invincible. The Sword King is the pride and treasure of the country, the strongest warrior, thanks to whom the country always occupies a high position in Northeast Asia. There was a correction here. It always occupied, since Yun Se-jin soon made an unexpected statement to journalists. He decided to change his name to Ryuhei and renounce his Korean citizenship to take Japanese citizenship. And in July 2020, the player joined the new Japan Self-Defense Forces. By asking to be addressed as Ito Ryuhei, the man sent the Korean BattleNet into the greatest shock in its history, and his departure plunged the country into chaos. It was on that day that Jihan returned. Crossing his arms over his chest, he chuckled, because he never liked this player. The news was all over the place about the Sword King's actions in letting his country down, and concerns about the fate of Korea's ranking in the league were growing. Korea, which was ranked high, has suffered a series of defeats and has fallen down the list at a terrifying rate. But even now, some analysts see little change in the rankings, and news channels optimistically point to talented young people, hoping that the country will remain in the top 20. Jihan, in a fit of anger, grabbed the remote control and turned off the TV. It was no wonder that with this approach the situation turned for the worse. No one could replace Se-jin. And everything would have been different if BattleNet had given Korea at least a little time, but the conditions were too strict. At the very beginning, BattleNet was a simple game. People on the go called the system with its signs and enthusiastically read the rules. But just 2 years later, when the Space League began, BattleNet became a battlefield for survival. If a player died in the game, then in reality he also lost his life. Such were the inexorable rules. In countries with low ratings, monsters appeared. Huge dinosaurs burning cities to the ground, monstrous spiders, two-headed werewolves, and other creatures invented by the system. This led to slaughter, wars, and millions of human casualties. After Se-jin's departure, Korea, as expected, sank to the bottom of the rankings and was destroyed. Those who were lucky enough to survive continued to repeat that it would not have ended like this if the Sword King had remained in his homeland. This man played a huge role for the country, as he possessed extraordinary strength. The portrait that hung in the room where Jihan woke up depicted his family, and next to a young girl holding a baby in her arms stood Se-jin. The face of the former national hero seemed to come to life and mocked the guy, unable to bear it. He punched the mocking grin with all his might, breaking the glass on the painting. The fragments painfully dug into the thin skin, but the only thing that worried the player was the question, why did his sister fall in love with such a bastard? Like a disease, the web from the broken glass spread across the entire portrait. But would everything have turned out differently if she had lived? The thought of going to the BattleNet headquarters, a skyscraper with a sculpture of two huge crossed swords on the roof, ran through my head like a computer line. Jihan frowned, looking ahead, biting his lower lip. It was good that he returned at this time. But now, having called up the system tablet to find out his indicators, he sighed in disappointment, since they turned out to be too low. The guy scratched his forehead sadly, fully aware that it was his own fault, since he had previously spent all his time drinking and gambling. In the past, he was a real fool, because he did not realize what an incredible thing he had. The system plate indicated that the player had a gift. Eyes of the Wanderer, allowing him to see information about other players. Everyone who turned 18 became a player, but only a small number of people received gifts. Jihan was given the lowest rated gift and only used the ability to predict the winner of various online bets. At that time, Song did not yet know that her true value would only be revealed after awakening. Looking at the table, he hissed in irritation at the sight of the nightmarish indicators. Were they really equal to the first level? Then how did he manage to get the second? After closing his eyes for a moment, the guy suddenly opened them, finally remembering what he had forgotten. His gaze fell on an overturned bottle of bright yellow liquid lying on the table. An experience potion. It was embarrassing to even remember that Jihan drank it when he was drunk, and then the level increased. Continuing to study his characteristics, the player stared in surprise at the new, previously unseen numbers and scratched the back of his head. 100,000 achievement points, and Jihan didn't know where they came from, since he hardly achieved anything before entering the league, especially since the points were free. Thinking that something might have changed due to going back in time, the guy opened his inventory. He instantly broke out in a sweat from the strain and let out a startled cry when he saw the image on the screen. X rank points. Exchange coupon, last survivor advantage. Choosing the path to test yourself again cannot be sold. Jihan wasn't sure that he was the only one with such an advantage. After thinking about it, he still clicked on the Achievement Points Exchange coupon button. The system added an achievement store. A golden shadow from the screen fell on the player's pale face, and he whispered words of delight with his lips alone. The gold plaque indicated many achievement upgrades, status windows, even spots for an additional class with more points. Jihan thought hard about whether he should improve the store. Then there would probably be more choice, but for now, there wasn't much to choose from. However, given the lack of many options, it was worth choosing at least something, so the guy decided to try to improve the store. The achievement store got a second level, but the player decided it wasn't for him and decided to continue. Next, the achievement store received a level 3, adding an additional place for the title, but this turned out not to be what was needed. There were only 50,000 points left. If the store was upgraded, it had 10,000 points left. The higher the level, the more expensive the upgrade. There were two choices left: buy up all the available options or level up. There was no point in thinking about it. Jihan put everything on the last attempt, and the achievement store reached level 4. The system notified that urgent recovery had been added. Jihan was scared for a second, not knowing what it was. Urgent repair provided the ability to restore a broken item to a new condition. The player buried his hand in his hair. This was bad. He was angry with himself, exclaiming dejectedly that he now understood the reason why he had not been able to give up gambling. Deciding to take a break, Jihan left the room and went to another, where before entering he put his finger on the sensor, which recognized his fingerprints and opened the door. The mechanical doors slowly opened. The mechanism loudly announced that members of the Jihan family were allowed to enter. Once in Song Jihan's playroom, the boy approached a large chair that looked more like the interior of a spaceship. Having climbed up the small glowing steps, the player sat down there, pressing the buttons on the dashboard, absent-mindedly thinking that the system had identified him in the absence of the owner. A sign appeared in front of his eyes, saying that Jihan had opened the BattleNet inventory and the player was going to use it. His first key is the corrupted Dong Fangshu brush. Rank A, a useless broken brush. But this was not a problem. The guy immediately gave the system a command for urgent restoration. The image on the screen began to change rapidly, and Dong Fangshu's damaged hand was gradually restored. After some time, 2 stones appeared on the brush, red and blue. The restoration was complete. Jihan extended his hand, squeezed his palm, smiled with satisfaction, and nodded to himself. Preparation complete. Dong Fangshu brush, SS rank, famous writer's brush, associated with the god of martial arts. An image of a tall, stately man, resembling a celestial being, appeared before the player. The brush from the system screen flew softly into the guy's hands, shining with a magical blue light that trembled in the air, wrapping around the object like a small snake. The player heard a cold, metallic voice announce that training in the Gangnam Bronze League would soon begin. There were 10 seconds left before the call. A state window appeared in front of Jihan, and he quickly jumped up from the chair, holding onto its back with one hand. The guy raised his brush up and smeared it across the screen, where a white blot immediately appeared. There was a reason why Jihan was able to take 7th place and become a martial saint. It combined strength, agility, and health points into a special, rare stat. The boy had never used this broken brush before, but what she wrote would begin his awakening. Jihan continued to swing his brush furiously as the seconds inexorably ticked away. Strength level, agility level, health level. Everything increased to 5. At the time the count ended, player Sun Jihan entered the BattleNet League. The huge coliseum is the main location of the BattleNet battles, and this time, the main task type is survival. A dry, metallic voice expressed hope that the players would survive when faced with the coliseum's monsters and hundreds of other players. This was the last thing Jihan heard while in his playroom. The next moment, he, still holding a brush in his hands, transformed right there in the arena under the hot summer sun. He was worried, not knowing what happened to the combat force, and immediately called up the status window. Jihan's eyes widened in surprise, as if he had no faith in himself at all. But now he saw his characteristics that had combined into a fighting force, and this meant that he had succeeded. The boy breathed a sigh of relief when he realized that he had gained combat power. completed the acquisition of a unique skill, and received 10,000 achievement points. Jihan smiled. Probably for the first time in a long time, he was finally here. It was just one step towards gaining the nameless divine arts. The combat strength increased to 5. This is enough to easily pass the Bronze League. The system sign announced that the player entered without joining the combat connection, without which he will experience 100% of the pain received. Jihan sighed dejectedly. He shouldn't forget that he lived in a world where pain was reduced by money. At this time, people were reducing the amount they received in the game more. Using the connection, Yunsei Jin had a high-tech one. It got rid of 99% of the pain. The guy clenched his fists, taking a deep breath, deciding to use it later. Through his closed eyes, Jihan heard a notification from the system that the achievements window was open. As it turned out, he received a limited task. He had to take first place in the training, the reward, 1,000 achievement points. This had not happened in the past. The player grinned at his own thoughts. With fighting force, it was easy to do. And now the game had begun, he needed to survive until the very end. Before the player had time to prepare, he heard heavy footsteps and the sound of a sword swinging behind him. Someone's youthful, mad laughter cut through the air like a sharp blade. The stranger shouted that the newcomer was caught, but his arrogance immediately disappeared. The player began to blink stupidly when he realized that something went wrong. The sharpest tip of his sword was caught in a grip, but not a normal one. It was simply clamped between his fingertips. Jihan didn't even need to turn around completely. He caught the dagger and turned his head slightly to see the attacker. The newcomer's eyes lit up with an unnatural blue light. For some reason, he thanked him for the first murder, the murder of people. The game had a guild, a group of people who trained and managed players. Since everyone in the world was interested in BattleNet, every country started investing resources in encouraging players. Thanks to active investments from well-known enterprises, large and small guilds emerged in South Korea that could prepare strong players for the league. For example, the Gangnam Bronze League, from the first zone, is a place where rising stars of guilds make their debuts. The game was about to begin. All the players, warriors, magicians, priests, knights, looked around warily. The young man with dark hair and new clothes, bought for the occasion of the game, was noticeably nervous. Du Hyukyo grabbed the hilt of his sword, telling himself to calm down. Everything would be fine, because he was luckier than the others. The guy was from the Divergent Guild, which was run by various groups. Very famous, it was this guild that included many rising stars. Hyukyo is an ordinary young man who was able to join Divergent after receiving the A-rank gift of agility, although only a small number of players received such a gift. Setting himself up for victory, Hyukyo narrowed his eyes, looking around, searching for his first opponent. It seemed he had not expected to see nothing but monsters and thugs around him. Having decided that these guys definitely wouldn't be touched, the guy tried to retreat to a safer area. He believed that the most important thing for completing the mission was to stay alive, so it was better not to run into trouble. Hyukyo continued to look around at the potential opponents, noting that most of those present were from large guilds with good weapons, as if they weren't even in the Bronze League. The player's search was successful. His gaze caught on a stranger with no visible weapon and not even a uniform. He stood carelessly with his back to the other players, as if he had entered the arena by accident. Was he really going to participate in the Bronze League looking like that? Heki raised an eyebrow, amazed at the newcomer's attire. He must have been summoned by accident. The player grinned, taking a better grip on the hilt of his cool sword. He decided that this weirdo would be easy prey, so he rushed at him from behind. He couldn't believe that he could make money for such an easy kill, and he even thanked the stranger out loud. The system just announced the start of the game, and Hyukyo sped up to kill the enemy right there and then and get the points he deserved. He raised his sword with a joyful cry and pounced on the newcomer, confident of his victory. The delight on Hyukyo's face turned into complete confidence, and a question appeared in his eyes. This guy seemed to sense danger on a subconscious level and caught the sword with his bare hands. The blade was held so tightly by someone else's fingers that his own hands were shaking. How could that weakling have managed to keep up with Hyukyo's speed? Meanwhile, the new guy, without taking his angry gaze away, easily let go of the sword. Hyukyo immediately fell to the ground, screaming desperately in pain and resentment. Without turning around, Jihan noted the other's self-confidence, assuming that he decided to participate in the Gangnam Bronze League because of some gift. Almost in tears, the warrior exclaimed that his A-rank agility was not a gift, and in general, such a rank is not a joke. Putting his hand in his pocket, Song turned around and shrugged, replying that he would not deny anything. Hyukyo cursed to himself because this poor man dared to despise him by blocking only one blow. He quickly rose to his feet and decided to attack with all his speed, using lightning magic. Jihan tensed up, seeing that the enemy had decided to attack with maximum effort, and it had been difficult to deal with him the first time. The player leaned forward, pointing the blade straight at the other's neck, this time not questioning his own agility. Alas, the sharp attack did not give him any advantages, because the newcomer dodged this time too. Hyukyo abruptly put his sword away, staring wide-eyed at the unremarkable opponent. Again and again, with enviable persistence, he attacked, but Jihan nimbly dodged, teasing the player. Without being distracted from the attacks, he thought that the feeling was completely different, and that the second level was again difficult to get used to. Rather, he himself has become too slow, and the enemy is not fast at all. It will not be easy. For Jihan's current status, after countless battles, the other's trajectory seems simple and obvious. This dangerous dance has been going on for more than half an hour, and it is not known who will be the winner. When his heavily breathing opponent jumped to the side once again, Don realized that he was reading all the moves. Taking advantage of the newcomer's hesitation, the angry Hyukyo screamed terribly and ran forward. Unfortunately, Jihan only now realized that he had lost his concentration. He turned around in horror, hearing someone else's cry, and was seriously scared in the first seconds. The guy managed to group himself and strike at the breach, knocking the sword out of the enemy's hands. How surprised Hyukyo was when his palm became empty in the blink of an eye. Not even a second passed before Jihan jumped into the air, grabbed the alien blade and landed on the ground. Eyes blazing with a bright light, Don turned and charged at his bewildered opponent. The sword was stuck in the throat of its former owner, and Hyukyo began to cough. He paid for his carelessness by shouting that it was absolutely impossible. Instead of blood, pixels gushed from the throat of the defeated enemy, and he fell to the ground, curled up into a ball. The body slowly disappeared into space. The guy bared his teeth, promising the new guy that the next time they met, victory would be his. Jihan shook his head. This player died, and he's already talking about another fight. Standing over the lifeless, ghostly body, he heard the system's voice asking about the first kill in the tutorial and about getting 100 achievement points. Following the player, the alien sword disappeared from Jihan's hands, to his great regret. Now he's warmed up, he can continue further, because to take first place for sure, he needs to kill more than 5 participants. The player walked a little further and saw out of the corner of his eye an empty part of the field. On the other side, dozens of pairs of monster eyes were staring at him. No one wanted to fight them. In BattleNet, in addition to players, there are monsters, but killing them is equal to 1/10 of a murder. You will have to finish off as many as 10. Therefore, most avoid them and prefer to fight with players, especially when it comes to orcs. Thinking that fighting them was simply stupid, a sign appeared in front of Jihan. The new task was to kill 30 of the strongest orcs. The reward for this was 500 achievement points. Then the player decided not to give up killing monsters because he would get the same number of points if he killed 5 players. Don scratched his head, because monsters are just monsters, they don't even look like real orcs. He stretched his body to prepare for the fight and the well-deserved reward. The guy decided to cross the field to get to the monsters with a few jumps. The orcs, looking intently ahead, began to hum and point their fingers. They couldn't believe that a man without equipment or weapons was running towards them. With a war cry, the monsters rushed forward, threatening to kill the madman on the spot. They swung their sharp axes with gusto, not doubting that they would chop the player into pieces. At first, Jihan looked at the floor, but then he raised his head, smiling mysteriously. He didn't slow down when he ran up to the orcs very close. The picture before his eyes merged into one. The monsters waved their weapons so quickly. Don covered himself with his hands as a sharp blade whistled past him. But somehow, in an unimaginable way, 2 axes ended up in the player's hands. At that very moment, he was going to show the impudent monsters how to throw them correctly. The guy swung his weapon with all his might and actually threw it into the crowd of orcs. The axe immediately chopped into pieces several monsters that stood in front. The other orcs growled as they saw their brethren die, their red-dotted eyes glowing in their terrifying faces. The man disappeared from their sight, moving faster than light. Now he was behind the crowd. With his second trophy, he began to cut up the monsters, finding himself right in the center of their cluster. A few seconds later, the severed, ugly heads of the enemies flew into the air. Jihan threw his hair back from his forehead as he dealt with some of the monsters. One of the orcs growled, opening his mouth wide, and called out someone's name. 5 of the 30 monsters were defeated. The rest surrounded the player, encircling him from all sides. He, without hesitation, turned around his axis, assessing the situation in a split second. The axe, which Jihan held tightly in his hand, entered the flesh of his opponents with refined movements. The guy moved like lightning from one monster to another, not allowing himself to be touched. Everywhere one could hear the growling of creatures calling for the killing of man. At one moment, a wooden spear with a sharp tip flew towards the player, and Don deftly intercepted it. Then he broke it in half, which was also not difficult for a second-level player. Scraping the sharp end of the equipment, he turned his head to see the puzzled orc. He stood alone, still holding the broken weapon, and grunted in surprise. Jihan swung his axe, expressing his contempt for the monster, saying that it shouldn't have screamed when attacked from behind. The monster seemed to be mad with fear because it did not even attack, but only tried to repel the deadly attack. Jihan, clutching the handle of the spear, broke it off from the other side. Now the almost defeated orc was left with only a useless wooden stick in his hands. Jihan spat to the side, mockingly informing that the orcs needed better weapons, ones that suited their size. The monster howled when he saw that the man's axe had also broken, and the others called for him to be killed finally. A hubbub of monsters rose above the arena. They approached the player again. He considered the orcs too persistent. Finding himself in the ring, he suddenly raised his leg and stepped hard straight onto the ground, destroying it. The blow was so powerful that a wave passed straight from the surface, knocking the monsters off their feet. Pushing off the ground, the player flew above the group of remaining orcs. A sharp, honed blade appeared in one of the guy's hands. In the second, he held the axe tightly and swung his sword in different directions to discourage his opponents. The guy soared into the sky so sharply that magical circles passed through the air, as if through water. Descending a little lower, he pointed the tip of the blade straight at the enemies. A few swings and the figures of half the group glowed blue, signifying a fall. The orcs, like pigs being slaughtered, squealed that they had lost their sight. Jihan got into a fighting stance, raising his weapons in both hands up. One swing of the sword and the bulky figure of one orc flew back. The player's magical wave of power pierced the monsters, piercing their bodies like a needle and thread. Like a sharp arrow, she flew out of the alien body, rushing into the distance. The surviving orc watched in bewilderment as his brothers one by one ended up lying on the ground. He opened his toothy mouth again, muttering that this player was not human at all. In the last seconds of his life, before Jihan chopped off the monster's head with one precise blow, he screamed that this was a real monster. The system announced the completion of the task, the destruction of the orcs. Jihan received 500 achievement points. Then, seeing that his level had increased, the guy was surprised by such a turn of events right in the middle of the game, because usually experience is calculated at the end. Perhaps this happened because of his low level, but it was even better this way. Now it was worth increasing the stat. Don wondered which one to choose, carefully studying the screen in front of him with the characteristics. Of the proposed ones was combat strength, a unique characteristic that combines strength, agility, and health points. Compared to statistics of the same level, this one doubles the player's capabilities. But there was another important reason why fighting power was special for Jihan. After gaining 30 points, he will have a chance to obtain nameless divine arts. He needed to get them as soon as possible, so the guy resolutely pressed the button to increase the characteristics. There was only one drawback. It was not so easy to pump up combat power. And yet, to Jihan's great surprise, the strength increased. The blue board showed the 6th level of the characteristic, mana, 5, and 1 remaining stat. Usually it required gaining combat experience and training to increase his strength. But for now, these points would only affect his growth rate. The player smiled. It was great anyway, even though he didn't know why it happened. He had barely wanted to note what would happen if things continued like this, when suddenly a girl's figure appeared in front of him. Something flew past the player's head a few centimeters away, shining with a bright green light. He realized with surprise that it was a magic arrow fueled by the participant's mana. The girl next to whom the knight stood smiled, calling Jihan a lucky bastard. She shook her hair, gathered in a high ponytail, and suggested finishing with the player quickly, because there was little time left, and the man nodded. He was going to be the first to deal with the new guy in order to take the reward. Sun shrugged, noting unsatisfactorily that players from different classes had teamed up, something that happened often. The survival map must be played player versus player, but there are no rules against teaming up. Judging by the emblem on the girl's clothes, she is a member of one of the best guilds in Korea, the Turtle Guild. Warrior and Archer, a combination of melee and ranged combat. If they are from the same guild, then everything is clear. Jihan heard the voice of the system. It announced that the training would soon end. There were 60 survivors left. If he just dodges, he will easily survive, but they are clearly in the mood to kill. It seems the couple thinks they have found an easy target. The knight even managed to flirt with the girl, inviting her on a date. A blue scoreboard appeared in front of Dawn. He had 4 kills. The guy was barely holding on to first place, and that was encouraging. He could definitely get first place. The girl, pulling the arrow onto the bowstring, shook her head with a smile, saying that the knight was much older, he should be ashamed. She snorted in surprise when a bright flash flashed before her eyes. The flash turned out to be Jihan's attack, unexpected and so sharp that it killed the girl right there. Here it is, the power of 6 points of combat strength. The knight standing at a distance froze when he saw his girlfriend being struck down on the spot. The man trembled, gritting his teeth. He could not believe that a newbie without equipment managed to kill a warrior. Without answering, Jihan instantly found himself behind the player, who until recently had not even been worried that he would not be able to defeat the guy. Don swung his blade and plunged it into the knight's back, who screamed desperately, scared to death. Jihan was surprised when he realized that his attack did not bring the expected result. The knight smiled tensely as he looked over his shoulder. His exclusive B-rank turtle armor was very durable. Gaining confidence, he assured that such a weapon would never penetrate it. But the man started and screamed hoarsely when the newcomer began to cover his back with more and more blows. He aimed at the same place, and even such powerful armor could not withstand the influx of attacks. Clutching his sword tightly in his hands, Jihan mocked the knight who was too arrogant and believed in his own victory. He said with a grin that the player deserved more suffering. The knight's shrill cry came from the computer screen, and 2 spectators calmly watched what was happening. Lee Hyo-yeon of the Divergent Guild, Human Resources Manager, head of the 3rd Department, whistled in surprise. She asked her interlocutor if she was happy with what was happening in the arena, and she was surprised. It was Lim Gayan from the same guild, Ha-young's bodyguard, asking her if the woman was glad that this guy wasn't standing in front of her now. Gayan could have been disqualified instead of being given 2nd place. Maybe he shouldn't have avoided a fight with a new guy if the opportunity presented itself. Haeyeon smiled, confident that her protector would never lose and would beat the guy. Gayan told the lady that she would refuse, but she shook her head. This is an order, so there will be a battle. The woman bowed her head obediently, ready to carry out the order. She looked closely at the screen. A shadow fell on Gayan's face. There, Jihan continued to cover the back of the unfortunate knight with powerful blows. Gayan could have sworn that she had seen this guy somewhere before. In the Divergent Guild, Lim Gayan was not the last person. Strong and agile, she could deal with any opponent in no time. A well-known and promising player with an S-rank gift. Her performance in the league lived up to all expectations. The woman had everything to take first place, and that is what happened if Song Jihan had not appeared. The Turtle Guild scout team was baffled as to how a man with no equipment or guild managed to get 6 kills on the 2nd level. Nobody knew who this guy was who walked into the arena wearing just a t-shirt and sweatpants. The system stated that Jihan took first place in the training. As a reward, he received 50% of the experience earned and increased his level to 6th. Sitting on the couch, the player was pleased with himself. He was leveling up so quickly because he was at the very beginning. There were no equipment points given for training, so he decided to invest the remaining stat points into combat strength and increase it to level 6. In addition, he was given a title for his achievements in the league. The bronze title, Conqueror of Learning, +1 to all stats and 20% additional experience gained. The title is only retained in the Bronze League, but that was still not bad. 10 points of combat power was like a free ticket to the Bronze League. The battle for promotion to the Silver League was available after level 25. He should concentrate on leveling up. Jihan remembered that he had the opportunity to get a class when he saw the stats board. Getting a class is an important moment when a player chooses a class. There are 4 options to choose from: Warrior, Archer, Mage, and Support. In his past life, Jihan chose the Warrior class. It would probably be easier if he chose it again. It was nothing new for the player. The achievement store also gave the opportunity to add a warrior for 10,000 points when choosing another class. The guy reached out his hand to select a class and clicked on the desired line. The living dead filled the entire space, growling sounds escaping from their mouths. The system invited players to the Bronze League in the Gangnam area. This time, the type of task is the defense of a high fortress, below which the living dead have gathered. They fell on top of each other, scratching and growling, trying to climb up. It was necessary to protect the crystals placed around the perimeter of the tower and survive the zombie attack. The battle will continue until there are 5 towers left. Lim Gayan stood by one of the crystals, looking down at her opponents. The woman narrowed her eyes in disdain, even though they were in the game. All this was too disgusting. The disgusting, dangerous living dead were ready to devour anyone who stumbled and fell down. At that moment, Gaeun heard the sounds of the system behind her. New players appeared on the small site. 2 guys. The blonde archer sighed when he realized that out of all the options, this was the card they got. He was from the LK organization with B-rank equipment. The one who showed up with him was a mage who wasn't even in the guild. But his equipment was impressive. The woman looked at the sky. She was waiting for another player, the most important one on this map. Now the support was supposed to appear on the site. The space immediately lit up with bright colors. Defense is a long-term fight. It's a war of attrition, and support is very important. Gaeun covered her face with her hands, saving herself from the bright light. But when she saw the new arrival, she was stunned. The 2 familiar facial features discouraged the bodyguard. She immediately realized that it was Song Ji-han. The new guy was now wearing a tracksuit and had a stick slung over his shoulder. As his body slowly manifested on the tower, the player looked around, asking if the defense was here. 20 minutes ago, when choosing a class, the system warned about not being compatible with the user, but Ji-han still chose what he wanted. There was only one reason for such a choice, which even the system considered unsuitable. A new ability, a divine power, unlocked after choosing a class is required for a new unique skill to appear. Otherwise, it is almost impossible to get it, even if you train hard. It won't help like with other skills, but there was another way to get it. This was an additional contribution to him, but Ji-han did not want to spend them. There was another way, one that no one knew about. And this is a very quick method that allowed the guy to show up for the mission. Gaeun met Ji-han with displeasure, not expecting him to choose such a class. The magician theatrically covered his face with his hand, shouting that this was madness, so he did not want to talk about training. He pointed his finger at Ji-han, asking if he was a beggar, because he had spent a lot of money on his own equipment, and now he would probably have to drag such a bungler along with him. Don didn't respond to this, but simply measured his ally with a glance. The archer tried to calm his comrade, saying that he was crossing all boundaries, but the guy irritably threw the stranger's hand away. The magician continued to shout that this was completely inappropriate and he would not play. Gaeun closed her eyes tiredly. Her new allies were too noisy, and it would be difficult to complete the task together with a newcomer. She flinched as she heard a new indignant cry from the smug magician. As it turned out, Ji-han, who had been silent the entire time, grabbed the offender and lifted him off the ground. He struggled and demanded to be let go, and the newcomer suddenly and easily agreed. For a moment, the magician was silent, only blinking his big eyes in surprise. An unknown force threw the grumpy magician, and now he was outside the tower. Ji-han didn't just let his ally go, he threw him into the air. A heart-rending scream filled the entire space as he fell like a stone, straight into the clutches of the living dead. And they were already opening their mouths wide and sticking out their long tongues in anticipation of a victim. Meanwhile, Ji-han unbuttoned his jacket and spat angrily, saying that if the magician didn't want to play, then let him not play. The archer and the bodyguard looked in shock at the newcomer, who didn't even change his expression after killing his ally. When the magician transformed again on the platform, the boy reached out to him again. Now the wayward player fell to his knees, begging not to kill him, because he would try his best. Kim Gyo-hyuk fell to the ground in his expensive gear and begged for mercy. This annoying mage didn't just start acting differently for no reason. In the Bronze League, you get 3 lives during defense. Kim Gyo-hyuk, after being killed by Son Ji-han, was immediately revived. The player then killed him again in cold blood, easily replying that he would rise again. Thus, Go-hyuk had 1 last life left. If he died again, he would take the last place. And this was what the players feared the most. The second time, the magician fell to his knees before his judge, assuring him that he would try his best. Looking at the floor, the guy clenched his teeth. He could not be last under any circumstances. For that, he would be punished by lowering his level. If the player's level does not match the ability level, it is automatically removed. Ji-han noted how quickly the mage changed his tactics. As it turned out, last time Go-hyuk tried to attack the offender with fire strikes. Hearing that the blows had worked surprisingly well, the magician suddenly raised his head. Then he smiled ingratiatingly and nodded vigorously. However, fire mages are very useful against entities that attack players. Getting to his feet, Go-hyuk, trembling, created a fireball on his palm to show off his skills, and he was level 15. He tried to appease Ji-han again, saying that he certainly wouldn't want to lose such a valuable team member. Gaeun shook her head, finally remembering where she could have seen this magician. Kim Gyo-hyuk was previously a member of one of the 10 great guilds, and was respected by everyone. But he lost the fight for promotion to the Silver League 4 times and caused a massacre. A real loser, that's what this guy was, but he exalted himself above others. He had barely managed to convince his judge when the magician decided to set a condition. Jihan looked at the player with bewilderment, who demanded an apology, and only then would he help the team. The archer supported his comrade, exclaiming that this was a good idea. Feeling the support, Go-hyuk became bolder, calling the offender a bastard in his heart. But he couldn't stand it and grabbed the impudent fellow by the collar again. Without further ado, Jihan once again lifted the boy off the ground and swung him with one hand as if he weighed nothing. He raised his head and smirked, asking the mage if he was sure of his demands. Go-hyuk acted as if nothing had happened, or as if he didn't understand what was waiting for him. The impudent fellow needed to be taught a lesson, and so for the third and final time he flew into the air. Looking at him attentively, Jihan swung his stick like a bat, and he hit the magician with it like a ball. He immediately screamed desperately, flying down. The system announced the death of the player, and Jihan, as if nothing had happened, called the remaining team. Winking at them, he asked them not to lose their heads. Meanwhile, the living dead stubbornly climbed up the slippery rocks. The crowd on the other side of the tower was washed off the wall by the fire. The other teams were successfully completing the tasks. Their fire mage was attacking the enemy with all his might. Jihan's team just looked at the others. The archer sighed heavily, realizing that they had lost the advantage of Hyogyuk. Finally, he got angry at the involuntary judge, shouting that he and the magician should have come to an agreement. Without answering, Jihan called up the status window, which indicated that for first place among 10 towers, one could receive 1,000 achievement shackles. The new information surprised him. It turned out that there was also a related task. For killing 1,000 zombies on your own, you could get 3,000 achievement points. Jihan thought seriously. He wanted to get a reward, but it was clearly not easy to complete the task. Guyan assessed the guy for some time, considering him to be the worst in many respects. I did what I wanted and chose the support class without taking into account my characteristics. Even an ordinary player doesn't do such nonsense. The Divergent Guild had no reason to keep an eye on him. The archer did not let up, demanding an answer from the player, threatening to leave him if he continued to behave like this. In response, Jihan asked quite sincerely whether it was possible to do so. His interlocutor did not expect such a reaction and did not even know what to say. Gayan reached for her sword, saying that she would be at the forefront and let the guy stay behind. The result was already predetermined, but the player's duty must be fulfilled. The woman was stunned when she heard that everything was fine, deciding that she had misheard. But Jihan had already rolled up the sleeves of his sweatshirt, saying that everything was fine, he would take care of the zombies. Let the rest stay and protect the crystal. At the very moment when the archer cried out in irritation, a dead man's hand appeared on the edge of the tower. An ugly monster, a bloody zombie with glowing red eyes, snapped its sharp teeth, slowly climbing towards the people. It was different from the usual one. The creature's head was made of liquid bone. It does not die from physical attacks. Such an opponent was too tough for such a team. He, having torn himself off the ground, rushed towards Jihan. At that moment, a bright beam tore the monster apart. Lightning circled around the player, guiding his homemade weapon. The rest of the team couldn't believe their eyes when pieces of the living dead man's body began to fall to the floor. Gayan followed them with her eyes only, not understanding what was happening. Could it be that this was the white sacred flame of divine power? Several other monsters had already managed to climb up the wall, and Jihan barely had time to wield his staff. Powerful blows pierced the dead bodies, cutting them into pieces. Another bloody zombie was already reaching out with a clawed hand towards the player. But Jihan did not allow anyone to come close to him, cutting the enemy with white flame. Jihan deftly threw the stick into his other hand. He didn't know if he could handle it. But killing another monster, I realized that it was worth trying. He had to kill 1,000 living dead on his own, because there was a good reward at stake. One by one, the guy attacked the enemies crawling towards the team. After some time, the number of zombies killed decreased, and he managed to kill 26. Jihan thought dejectedly that attacks really didn't work on the bloody zombies. He decided that he would release some divine power when they appeared. This was necessary in order to finish them all off at once. Another bloody zombie fell down, thrown from the tower. The guy's attacks were admired by other players. Even the archer acknowledged his strength. He realized that he was wrong to think that Jihan was an idiot, and he exclaimed loudly what a good job he was doing. Gayan watched in amazement as the boy freely used divine power during battle without any unnecessary expenses. From the very beginning, he hit the heads of the living dead with utmost accuracy. A few minutes later, Dawn stopped, dozens of bodies lying at his feet. The system announced that the condition had been met. The boy fully understood the faith of the other world, but the divine power increased from 6 to 7. He knew another way to increase divine power, and this method fortunately worked perfectly. Divine objects were sacred. In the year 2010, when the teaching on Earth began, they were sold at a high price, justifying it by the presence of secrets in the objects. After 10 years, none of them had been discovered, so the value of the items gradually decreased, especially the seemingly divine items that were not suitable for use as weapons. Many people didn't even know they existed. Priestess Sophia, top 3 of the America First Guild, revealed that she had increased her divine power with an item from another world. The interlocutor with whom she was training stared at the girl in surprise. Sophia nodded, saying that after finishing her training, it still wouldn't work. She deftly jumped off the bench and nodded her head, saying that it was possible, and that was how she became a priestess. If you hold it for a long time and pray, you can gain divine power, although the conditions vary slightly from item to item. The interlocutor ruffled his hair. He didn't know about such a simple method, but such items are incredibly difficult to find. Thanks to this, the girl managed to monopolize all divine items. Sophia thought for a moment and replied that this was not entirely true. There was someone who was constantly collecting divine items, Jihan thought. Jihan returned in time to the Sword King's penthouse and saw something incredible in the house. All the divine items were collected there. They were empty due to the power being drained. The Holy Grail, the cross, the medallion, the divine items of the other world have been deactivated. The boy stood by the useless trinkets, wondering if this was the case. The person who collected these items was known to him. The older sister, Songjia, is the girl holding the baby next to Yoon Se-jin. Together with him, the girl was Korea's best support and heroine. Her death is a long story, not the most pleasant to remember. Among the items she left behind, Jihan found a steel staff. Otherworld priests strengthened their faith by hitting cult members on the head with it. Judging by the description, they were supposed to smash the heads of the living dead, which is what Jihan was now doing. The item's rank has increased, and it can absorb just a little more divine power, but its heaviness already makes it great for striking. Gaeun noted the guy's amazing physical fitness and how well he controlled everything. The archer excitedly noted that a tower had fallen not far from them, and those players were highly rated, and they managed to enter the top 5. A zombie roared next to him, opening its mouth wide. When the archer, in a trembling voice, suggested joining the fight, the bodyguard did not wait, but began to chop down the living dead with her sword. Noticing the movement, Jihan was briefly distracted from the carnage. He was surprised by the woman's ardor, catching something familiar in her movements. The sword that Gaeun wielded was called Plum Blossom. Gaeun was famous for temporarily holding the position of Sword King, but she met a tragic end. She died at the hands of Yoon Se-jin, and the guy once had the chance to save her. A woman's voice brought Jihan out of his thoughts. She asked if the player would mind if they helped, then the team would take a higher place. Without answering, Dawn called up the status window. They were in 5th place with 398 kills, with a little more to go. The player decided that the Plum Blossom sword would do just fine without him. Nodding to his ally, Jihan encouraged her to continue in the same spirit. He left the living dead to the warrior and the magician, soaring somewhere upward. The puzzled players stared at Jihan's back, not expecting such a turn of events, and he was already flying down straight into the thick of the crowd of monsters. The player's gaze was directed straight at the target. He gripped the staff tighter, intensifying the divine fire. If he gathers the rest together, he will be able to tear them to shreds. His mana rushed into the group of normal and bloody zombies. The archer, watching his ally, whistled in amazement. The system announced that the group was the last survivors. They completed the limited quest, take first place among 10 towers. The game was over. The guy moved back to the tower platform. The archer greeted him with a standing ovation, shouting that this support was amazing and thanking him for his efforts. Jihan didn't pay any attention to him, thinking that he had to try again since he had become stronger. The guy was looking for something on the screen, continuing to think while the archer was praising him to the fullest. Gaeun, also ignoring the cries of her ally, thoughtfully approached the edge. She didn't believe that an independent player was capable of doing something like this alone, especially a low-level support. Was this some kind of error in the system? The woman shuddered when she heard the archer's voice. He said that he was leaving. Jihan buttoned up his jacket, deciding that it was time for him to go out and receive his reward. He froze when he heard Gaeun call his name. Plum Blossom's sword, she looked him straight in the eyes. Dawn didn't look away, asking if his bodyguard knew. She was determined to talk, because a person with such potential and achievements was needed by the Divergent Guild. In order to recruit him, Gaeun, as a member of the guild, needs to do something. The woman decided to ask the guy for his phone number. She continued to stand and look at Jihan, But a few seconds passed before the warrior herself was surprised by her own request. The player himself seemed not to understand what was wanted from him, perceiving it as a manifestation of a different kind of attention. Gayun waved her hands, exclaiming in fear that this was not what she meant. Finally, having calmed down, she tried to explain everything in order. But Jihan interrupted her speech, asking for forgiveness. He suddenly announced that he didn't remember his number, which surprised the woman even more. Pressing something on the system screen, Jihan said goodbye, saying that he would give it to him as soon as they saw each other again. The next second, his figure dissolved into the blue color of the system. The bodyguard didn't understand how it was possible not to remember her number. Then she sighed, realizing that the guy had probably turned her down in this way. Jihan walked along the crowded streets of the city, scratching the back of his head. And he really didn't remember the Korean number, since he had previously used an American one. The player walked past a cafe where people were quietly having lunch, thinking that he didn't know who to ask about something like this. Don seemed to have just realized that they wanted to accept him into the guild. There was an advertisement on the roof of the neighboring house about joining the guild. He probably distinguished himself greatly. He could have asked for Gayun's number himself, but the guy wasn't planning on joining the guild yet. He called up the status window because there were more important things for now. The level increased by 2, and I also managed to earn 1,500 equipment points and increase my divine power. But the equipment store still didn't have anything he could afford. Jihan decided to go home and rummage around in his sister's closet some more. The elevator doors closed behind the guy, barely audibly. The fingers quickly dialed the desired floor combination. Lost in his own thoughts, Jihan opened the door to the apartment. Entering there, he lowered his head, noticing something unusual. The guy's eyes widened in surprise at what he saw. There was a pair of women's boots on the floor, which made Jihan freeze in amazement. The bag of noodles fell to the floor with a loud thud from his weakened hands. Everyone has a moment in life that they regret, and Jihan regretted a lot in his past. Now he opened the door to the room with shaking hands. Until now, the guy could not forgive himself for not protecting one important person. Her ghostly silhouette slipped past, casually talking to Jihan about everyday things. There was so much he wanted to tell her when they met. In those moments when Jihan drank himself to death, the girl encouraged him. Looking into the void, the boy spoke of how strong Seo was. The girl carefully took the bottle from the stranger's hands, promising to protect him. His niece's face shattered into tiny pieces before his eyes. He couldn't protect her and was endlessly remorseful. Jihan clutched the lifeless body in his arms, screaming terribly somewhere into the sky. But now Sia stood in front of her parents' portrait, smiling broadly at her uncle. He missed her so much even though it probably sounded shameless. Without blinking, Jihan could not take a step, much less say anything in response. This year marks the 18th birthday of his niece, the daughter of Yoon Se-jin and his older sister. Having mastered himself, the guy swallowed the lump in his throat, asking if the night in Jeju was over. The girl laughed, replying that she had left before everyone else. Jihan looked after the baby from childhood because she was born when his sister was working to provide for the family. And now, having lost her entire family at an early age, for her uncle Sia is more important than anyone else. She is his family. Pressing his hand to his face, Jihan asked if the girl had called her father. She lowered her head, her thick bangs covering her eyes. As it turned out, he fell in love with a woman and told his daughter about it over the phone. She shuddered, deciding that her father had gone crazy. Would he really abandon her and leave her alone? And this was the condition of that woman in exchange for her love. The daughter did not believe that her closest person agreed to this absurdity. Jihan bared his teeth when he heard this stupid story. However, he could not do anything because this man had always been like this. Irresponsible, selfish. He abandoned his own daughter and country for a woman. Barely containing his anger, the girl's uncle scolded his father-in-law, while Sia noticed the portrait for the first time. Pointing at him with her hand, she asked if Jihan had broken the glass on him. He cursed under his breath and immediately asked for forgiveness, explaining that he had become very angry at that moment. Just when he decided that he had acted too rashly, Sia smiled and said that she had wanted to do it herself. Jihan's anger disappeared, giving way to bewilderment. The girl assured that she was fine, despite the death of her mother and the betrayal of her father. She never stops smiling and worries about her uncle more than about herself. But the thing is, she doesn't have to be like that anymore. Jihan reached out his hand to his niece, deciding that he could not allow her to take care of him. The boy patted Sia on the head, saying that she was already quite grown up, and he even knows how to take care of his uncle. The girl blinked in surprise. She knew that Jihan would not let anyone hurt her and would protect her. He asked her not to overwork herself. And Sia agreed for the first time in a long time, thanking her uncle. The girl pressed herself against Jihan's jacket and immediately recoiled. Laughing, she noticed that he smelled of sweat, causing her uncle to gasp and become embarrassed. In the Gangnam area, the Divergent Guild was located in one of the prominent buildings. Guyan stood there, ashamed, staring at the wall. Clutching her sword, she exhaled and asked Mrs. Hayoung not to hold back her laughter. The woman was indeed trying her best not to burst out laughing. Finally, she burst into loud laughter, asking her bodyguard for forgiveness through tears. Wiping away a tear, Hayoung noted Jihan's sense of humor, who didn't even give his phone number to the great Gayun, and even said that he didn't remember it. Gayan lowered her head, answering that she was powerless here because people always judge by appearance, and she was not as beautiful as the lady, and generally looked like a man. Hayoung immediately stopped laughing, looking cautiously at the bodyguard. She raised an eyebrow, thinking she had a problem. Doesn't this girl realize how popular she is, and doesn't hear the guys in the guild whispering behind her back about wanting to ask her out on a date? The lady waved her hand, asking Gayan to ask people's opinions. They would clearly convince her otherwise. In the break room, the bodyguard asked Hayoung what she planned to do about hiring Jihan. She sighed heavily, answering that he needed to be convinced at any cost, because the old people, like madmen, insisted on arranging everything as quickly as possible. The head of the third department's gaze fell on the screen of the phone lying nearby. There was a notification about a live broadcast, a prediction of the winner of BattleNet from Mr. Sun. The woman transferred the image to the screen, surprised by the event, since there were no major fights today. Gayan didn't know that Hayoung was still watching gambling broadcasts, but the lady convinced her that they were just analyzing strategies. Both were stunned when they saw who appeared on the screen. Jihan himself leaned towards the camera, asking Xia if everything was working properly. The bodyguard screamed, not knowing that Hayoung was watching the players' live broadcasts, but she waved her hand. Now the guy claimed to be the Sword King's son-in-law. The commentators were as shocked as the guild members when they saw the roof of the Sword Palace, which only members of the Seijin family could enter. Jihan asked her niece to stand a little further away, and she nodded. Suddenly, to everyone's surprise, Jihan's figure was illuminated by divine fire, and he raised his leg in the air. And after a few seconds, he forcefully put her on the ground, destroying the floor. From the place where he stood, cracks appeared. They went straight to the symbol of the Sword King, 2 crossed blades. This statue was a landmark of Korea. No one could have imagined that they would decide to destroy it. It was visible that a huge crack had opened up right under the swords. Jihan's figure looked quite small compared to the statue, but that didn't make it any less majestic. With wide eyes, the boy raised his fist straight in the direction of the blades. The space was illuminated by divine fire. Less than a minute passed before the statue was shattered into hundreds of tiny pieces. The system lit up with achievement completion signs, and Jihan was incredibly happy, feeling relieved, saying that he now wanted to talk about the citizenship of the Sword King, Yoon Sejin, a platform that has no equal in the world, the BattleNet streaming platform. Being part of the BattleNet, the number of viewers, subscribers, and views will help the player to get the achievement rewards. With such a loud title for Jihan, there will be no better chance to get all the rewards. He gathered viewers and received 100,000 dislikes on this live broadcast. But this was not a surprise for the guy. After all, there is some benefit from Yoon Se-jin too. Jihan noticed one particularly active commentator, or rather his profile picture, 2 swords, and he was scolding the player for destroying the statue. The guy was no less angry at the sword fandom, because it was the club of crazy fans of Yoon Se-jin that drove Xia to death. People supported the hero. Their anger grew and gradually turned towards his only relative, Yoon Xia. They claimed that the Sword King had abandoned his country because of his disobedient daughter and that the girl must die for him to return. The frenzied crowd literally devoured Xia's energy and strength alive, exhausting her morally and physically. Like many sharp daggers, cruel words pierced the girl, leaving her no chance to live. Jihan's jaw muscles twitched in silent rage. He knew that people needed someone to blame and take out their anger on. The guy decided that he would gladly become a target for their emotions, and with some inner joy he smashed the statue, causing a surge of angry comments. Seiya looked at her uncle in surprise as he announced to everyone on the stream that Ito Ryuhei would not be returning. Jihan walked away from the destroyed swords, taking something out of the inside pocket of his jacket. The commentators were amazed at what a player from the Bronze League was doing. He pulled out the phone containing the recording of Ryuhei's conversation with his daughter after he decided to accept Japanese citizenship and held the device up to the camera. The stream was broadcast directly to the main square in the city, and all residents were able to hear with their own ears how their national hero leaves his country for another woman. Lee Hae-young's mouth dropped open in confusion, while Lim Gaeun's eyebrows furrowed. She considered the man a real bastard. Many huge screens in the city center broadcast a stream. The voice of the national hero left his own daughter for a new love. This was the woman's condition in exchange for her love. After these words, Jihan turned off the recording. He turned around and looked cautiously at his niece, who was standing silently to the side. Sia smiled at her relative, as they had agreed, and the girl nodded in agreement. She walked up to the camera and awkwardly bent down to get into the frame, then introduced herself, and the commentators immediately noted the beauty of the King of the Sword's daughter. The girl straightened up and clasped her hands in front of her, saying that she was shocked by the situation and that she was here to say something. As it turned out, the father left his daughter the Sword Palace as an inheritance, but being honest and fair, Sia could not accept the inheritance from a man who abandoned his country and family. Therefore, the girl firmly decided to give the house bequeathed to her country. Jihan lowered his head as he listened to his niece's words. She hoped that the donation would be a great help to the Korean players. However, knowing that the cameras couldn't see him, he allowed himself to grin. 30 minutes ago, he himself suggested this to Sia. She cried out in amazement upon hearing about such a sacrifice. The uncle was just drying his hair with a towel after coming out of the shower, and the girl patted him on the cheek, noticing that he didn't look drunk. Sia clasped her hands in a prayerful gesture, asking her uncle in surprise why he wanted to give away everything they had. Sun noticed that his mind was sharper than usual and thought for a few seconds, his hand hovering over his head, holding the towel. He wasn't sure that he could convince his niece, especially since he didn't ask her to sell the house at an exorbitant price, but to donate it. But this had to be done at any cost, because when Seijin destroyed Korea, as a representative of Japan, the anger of the Koreans got out of control. The government could not cope with the discontent and confiscated the property of the traitor. Sia had nowhere to go. She couldn't withstand all the threats and persecution from the Sword King fan club. The girl decided to take a terrible and irreversible step. She took her own life. Therefore, since the house will be taken away anyway, it is better to give it back ourselves and protect everyone. Crossing his arms over his chest, Jihan grimaced, knowing that he now looked like an ordinary freeloader and drunkard, spending all his days at home because he couldn't tell his niece that he came from the future. Sia considered her uncle's words, still staring at him. And the next moment, completely unexpectedly for the player, she agreed. Shrugging her shoulders, she walked into the room. Jihan rushed after the girl, asking again if she really agreed. But there was no point in asking questions. Sia said that her uncle was not the type to ask for something like that without a reason, which stunned the guy. However, besides this, the girl had not seen him so confident for a long time. Jihan couldn't come to his senses for several more long minutes, looking after his niece in confusion. He couldn't understand who Sia had grown up to be, and remembering their conversation now, he only shook his head with a smile. Looking at his sister's daughter, the player thought she was an absolutely amazing person. The commentators did not support the girl's idea, saying that the guy was a fraud and was clearly not the son-in-law of the Sword King. But this didn't upset him either. Jihan was ready for attacks. Then, if everything went like this, there would be no claims against Sia. Stepping forward and looking straight into the camera lens, he addressed Yoon Sang-jin, assuming he would listen. Even though Jihan's suit was torn from his previous actions, he still knew that he had done a great job. Sia looked at her uncle in shock, who spoke in unprepared text. Her father justified his actions by a woman. What made the commentators laugh was the words about the national hero. Jihan called him a nobody. He grabbed the half-torn sleeve of his jacket and loudly announced that Seijin had flown to Japan only because of his failure in Korea. Even Lee Hae-young and Lim Gaeun were completely shocked by these words. The women did not expect this on a live broadcast. Throwing aside the torn sleeve, Jihan declared that the man should enjoy his stay in Japan, because if they met again soon, he would destroy him. The strange stream ended in the sunset of the city landscape, and the comments continued to discuss what happened for a long time. When the family returned home, Jihan was changing clothes. Sia was immersed in reading comments on her phone, and asked her uncle if it was necessary to go so far. Moreover, now both the Koreans and the Japanese are outraged. But Sun replied that everything is fine. There is no need to pay attention to them and worry about trifles. The girl suddenly tore herself away from her mobile phone and quietly said that Jihan was now different, as if he had changed overnight. He rolled his eyes and scratched his cheek, satisfied that his niece had noticed after all. But he clearly wouldn't be able to act like he normally did after dying and going back in time. As soon as the player noticed that he looked like a dependent who drank all day, there was a knock at the door of the apartment. Both residents froze. Sia sat down on the sofa, thoughtfully asking who it could be. Sun put his hands in his pockets, expressing that he had not expected such a quick visit, while his niece became worried that they had already come for her uncle. Jihan waved his hand, asking Sia not to worry because it was not what she thought. He needed to earn some money anyway. Meanwhile, in Japan, in Tokyo, where both night and day, the city lights never went out for a second. Sejin watched the news system screen while sitting on his bed. They were still discussing about the Sword King receiving citizenship from another country. The woman, who had been lying quietly until then, moved closer, putting on a robe. She couldn't sleep because of the recent upheavals. Shizuru was worried that Seijin was going through such hardships, and he asked to be called by his Japanese name. His lover's hands closed around Sechijin's stomach, and she shook her head. Korea's top 1 player, the King of Sword, Yoon Sejin, and he will always remain so. The man turned around, feeling a touch on his cheek, looking into Shizuru's eyes in surprise. The magic of love hovered around the woman, drawing her lover to her. It was as if she was sharing her own breath with him, confessing her love. Both clung to each other, merging in a kiss, a pink, suffocating aura enveloping the couple. In Korea, Jihan opened the door to the uninvited guest and invited him in with a smile. The man standing at the threshold apologized for the intrusion, but still slowly took off his shoes. Sun said that he expected the government to intervene because the matter was important. The manager of the BattleNet department of the South Korean government, Park Yoon-sik, a respectable middle-aged man, came to visit the family. After Yoon Se-jin left, his department had not come to visit. Now Jihan gestured for Yoon-sik to come in. He greeted Sia. This man made sure that the boy and girl were taken into account. The Sword King's daughter straightened up and lowered her head, greeting him respectfully. The player watched the guest leave, contentedly thinking that now that everything was prepared, he would be able to take what he needed. Yoon-sik was offered tea, and while it was cooling, the man shared his impressions of the show, calling it quite cruel. The government has accepted the fact that the Sword King cannot be brought back, but they cannot let the citizens know about it so quickly. As soon as Jihan heard that a fight between Korea and Japan would soon take place, he immediately asked Yoon-sik to get down to business. The manager took a pointed sip of tea when the player asked if he should refuse the donation of the Sword Palace, as it was an official admission that the king would not return. Yoon-sik immediately squeezed the thin handle of the cup tighter and swallowed hard, admitting that it was so. The man peered carefully into the player's face, remembering him as an unemployed alcoholic who was obsessed with gambling. He nevertheless admitted that the government had not yet given up hope for the return of Yoon Se-jin, and he offered Jihan to become a contract manager instead of a donation. Sun crossed his arms over his chest, realizing that they wanted to put the responsibility of management on him until the real owner returned. He asked the manager if the house would go back to the returning owner, and the man quickly began searching for something in his folder, nodding. He added that it would be good if both relatives remained in the Sword Palace and placed a contract for the manager on the table. Having pushed the papers towards the young people, Yoon-sik said that all the conditions there were favorable for both parties. They needed to read the contract and think about it. Carefully studying the documents, Jihan decided that it was even better for him if the government wanted otherwise, because at the beginning, he was going to give everything. Putting the papers aside, he slammed the table hard, announcing that the family also had a request. Sia blinked her eyes in confusion, not knowing what to say, since she had not been involved in the conversation to begin with. The system announced the beginning of the Golden Light Stream, which was immediately greeted by the commentators. Someone was surprised that the player climbed onto the head of the Coliseum statue. The fair-haired knight, a handsome guy, put his hand to his head as a visor, greeting everyone on his stream. He reported that today everyone had to return to the bloody and dusty Coliseum, where the players were already gathering in the arena. The young man called himself a streamer, a travel specialist who came back to the people smiling happily. He took a running start and jumped down from the statue, landing deftly on his feet. Then he masterfully drew from its sheath a sword, as golden and prominent as his armor, which screamed of wealth and luxury. One of the spectators donated to the player, and he was overjoyed, promising to dance for his benefactor. The guy was bending in different directions and even showed the back of his armor, which caused puzzled looks from the other players. They obviously didn't like the local upstart. A player from another class even prayed for him to be hit by a car. Streamer Golden Light didn't pay attention to evil tongues and sidelong glances. A notorious buffoon, he was popular for his hyperactive appearance. The boy was once a respected member of the Golden League until he decided to drop down to bronze, saying he was going to explore the depths of the sea. Space Jester? In fact, he wasn't interested in the game, the streamer only cared about having fun. He was madly interested in sea creatures more than in real life. His gear and stats are still at gold rank, so he has fun hitting and killing bronze players who are weaker than him. Others believe that he is a real psychopath who burst into the arena and called victims to him, allowing them to choose who would be first. Carefully examining the arena, Golden Light suddenly froze when he saw him. Jihan was standing nearby, holding one of the new weapons, and the streamer saw content in the guy. He rushed towards Sun, pointing a microphone at his mouth, declaring that he wanted to take the Sword King's son-in-law, the smasher of the statue of the two swords that everyone was interested in lately. Gihan looked at the annoying streamer and turned away, remembering that he had only a few achievements left to get. Having called up the system table, he began to move his finger along the table. It was necessary to raise the views. As the stream continued, the player turned to the camera, gave a thumbs up, and stated that he was being completely ignored. Seeing the many comments, the Space Jester's mouth dropped open in surprise, realizing that the Bronze League player was also streaming. Golden Light began to bite his nails in tension when he realized that he had simply given free publicity to an unlucky player. He glanced at the system sign and wondered how he could make people watch only his stream. One of the viewers offered the streamer a deal for 2,000 gear points. Kill Sun Jihan so that he would take the last place. The player was amazed by such generosity. Because 1 point of equipment costs about $1,000, the Sword King fandom was ready to take revenge on the offender and increase the reward. A plan for enrichment was already maturing in the Jester's head. He knew that the fandom hated Jihan, but he didn't think it was that strong. The awards increased with each new commentator more and more often. The guy's eyes ran across the screen, and he himself was beside himself with what he saw. Now the reward was calculated in simply incredible numbers. Golden Light blushed and quickly covered his mouth with his hands. The number of points will soon reach 40,000, and 50 is not far away. The system announced the start of the game and the call for all players. The knight fell to his knees, stuck his sword into the sand, and screamed loudly, his mind exploding from the bright prospects. The streamer covered his face with his hands, causing even more disgust among those around him. He couldn't agree until the amount increased to 50,000. One of Yoon Se-jin's fans made a strong-willed decision. He promised to add 10,000 equipment points if the player defeats Son Jihan. Hearing this, the Jester concentrated so much that he turned black and white and entered the greedy mode. It was a great deal for the guy, and he stated that the determination of the Sword King fandom rubbed off on him. Son Jihan stood with his back to the knight. The Jester challenged the player to begin to fall into despair. Its active ability, Charge, accelerated the user's body and allowed them to rush forward at high speed. Streamer emitted a golden light and was about to end someone else's game. As the Jester raised his blade above his head, a golden flash lit up the air. He himself shouted that he would become Jihan's personal death, intending to pounce on him from behind. The bronze player, even feeling and hearing the incredible danger, did not even turn around in the first seconds. But then, when his opponent was a few centimeters away, Sun turned around and in a split second made such a lightning-fast move that it prevented the other player from touching him. The golden light froze and raised its head, realizing that its hand had stopped obeying its owner and was simply hanging above. As it turned out, Jihan had a 0-rank kitchen pusher in his hands. On another planet, aliens use a pusher to cook atheists. The system suggested supplementing it with a kitchen knife. The guy chuckled that he had no choice but to fight with what he had, and reached into the inside pocket of his sweater. The golden light stood awkwardly, continuing to look at the poorly equipped player who ironically wanted to match his weapon. The streamer himself did not understand how he ended up being attacked by something incredibly sharp. The bronze player jumped to the side, finishing actively waving his hand, clutching a regular knife in his fingers. His opponent couldn't hold back and screamed at the top of his lungs, the alien energy still holding him in the air. The commentators were furious that the bronze player was already using divine power and a support class, and the system had just announced the spilled first blood and increased the player's achievement points. He raised the kitchen knife in front of him with interest. On another planet, aliens used it to cook the atheists. The Jester rose and resurrected, theatrically folding his arms across his chest, saying that he did it for the sake of all the players. As it turned out, the player had a resurrection cross. It allowed the user to resurrect once. The boy reappeared in the arena, his eyes downcast, his red cloak fluttering in the air, falling right on Jihan. Putting his finger to his temple, the Jester said with a smile that because of his inattention, the audience was disappointed, and that he would soon repay Jihan for all his suffering. The guy clearly didn't expect that the enemy would be right behind him. Listening attentively to this speech, The golden light froze in fear, turning its eyes to Jihan, who grinned. Less than a minute later, the confident streamer's figure was painted in the colors of the system. Player Sun Jihan committed a double kill. As he walked away, he thought that no one had used resurrection before, and it was not worth repeating. Not because of the fines, but because of the vulnerable position of the resurrected. Jihan turned towards the raised area of the arena. Under the canopy sat the observers who had come to watch the game. Because of this, the atmosphere around was more tense. Today they were beautiful elves. The commentators noticed how they looked at Sun. The player was shaking just by looking at these creatures, because they played a big role in the fall of humanity. But he planned to deal with them later, and now it was worth concentrating on pressing problems. Looking around, Jihan noticed for the first time that he had remained isolated in the arena. Apparently, he had been counted among the outcasts. Moreover, the other players, seeing that he turned around, ran away screaming. Knights, monks, mages, everyone rushed forward, shouting that now was not the time to fight each other, because Sun had killed even a Gold League player. The guy shrugged and sighed heavily, thinking that it would now be more difficult for him to kill. However, he finally found D-rank holy items. He no longer needs to fight to fulfill the condition to use them. Lost in thought, the player weighed the knife and the pusher in both hands, looking at the system screen. The boy raised an eyebrow and smirked when he saw the new game task. He needed to subdue all the goblins that had gathered around the goblin champion. A disgusting creature with yellow eyes and sharp, half-rotten teeth growled as it appeared next to Jihan. But not even a minute had passed before he suddenly turned around and ran away, begging to be saved from the player filled with divine power, rushing after him with a mortar. The creature didn't manage to escape far, its mouth opening and closing silently when a heavy blow fell on its head. Jihan gripped the kitchen knife tightly in his palm, preparing to launch his next attack. Using it as a basis for a fight, Sun stunned the goblin and sent him flying with a mortar. The condition for using holy items has been met, and the items from the D-rank cooking set have been used together. It was necessary to hit one on the head and the other to pierce the heart. Since they are from a set, they have a certain order of use. Straightening up, the player thought with satisfaction that he was lucky to figure this out before the end of the game. Jihan spent a lot of time. If he could have mastered the weapon earlier, he would have been able to kill more goblins. But, noticing the shadow hanging over him, the guy realized that this was not the end. A huge champion goblin loomed over the man compared to ordinary goblins, whose height is only a meter. Such goblins have increased physical and mental strength. Complaining that the system had given too long a description, Jihan knocked the goblin out with one blow of the mortar. The heavy body fell at the man's feet within a few seconds. Raising the knife, the player hissed, not understanding what all the fuss was about when in fact the monster was just tall. He swung the kitchen knife and plunged the weapon into the goblin champion's heart. For his efforts, the system rewarded the player with another point of divine power. Cooking sets. The pusher and kitchen knife have been downgraded after this 1-second battle. Since they were still E-rank, Jihan could earn divine power points again. But these items were not very suitable for killing monsters. At the other end of the arena, the sounds of blades, striking, and war cries could be heard. Sun decided that it was time to catch the players, because they had gone too far. The guy started rolling up his sleeves, muttering that it would be bad. But nothing could be done, because if they didn't come to him. Divine power was radiating from the player in all directions. He firmly decided that he would approach the others himself. The commentators were talking with all their might about how terrible Jihan's appearance was. In the real world, Seoul, Gangnam District, Yeoksam Station, there was peace. But not in the apartment and the gaming chair of the Golden Light, which did not look as frightening as in the game. The guy sat in front of 4 wide monitors pointing at Jihan's image and was indignant about the latest incident. The streamer watched as the player he hated dealt with goblins. He had too high stats. The jester fell headfirst onto the keyboard, starting to whine that in the Bronze League people have a maximum of 20 stat points, and Jihan has a lot of them. Howling sounds were heard from the speakers. The guy chuckled something and raised his head. As it turned out, player Son Jihan committed the murder by knocking out another user with a mortar. Golden Light's eyes widened at what he saw on the screen. All the censored words suddenly flew out of my head, because something was happening that no one could have expected. With the help of, albeit divine, but still ordinary objects, Jihan moved straight through the corridor of players, knocking each one off their feet. He committed double murder time after time without fail, and the system signs kept popping up in the air. Even the commentators who didn't believe in him couldn't deny the guy's success, because killing 4 people in flight seemed impossible. Triple kill, mega kill, rampage, and this is only a small part of what Jihan did. A line of opponents flew into the air and fell flat on the ground. The users were beside themselves with rage. The shooter demanded additional improvements for himself from the magician, who snapped back irritably. One of the bolder players loudly called out to Jihan, calling him a cheater and a deceiver. The shooter shouted that he had had enough of victories and that the guy needed to leave the arena. Without blinking an eye, Sun began to fight off the stream of arrows fired at him. The attacks were unable to reach their target because the player was a master at wielding the mortar. The intense gaze with enviable speed anticipated which direction the arrow would fly in and immediately deflected it. Finally, when the shooter simply ran out of weapons, Jihan looked in that direction with some strange expression on his face. Both warriors immediately drooped, starting to giggle stupidly in different ways, almost dropping the objects in their hands onto the ground. A few seconds later, Jihan was already standing nearby with a raised dagger, and the system notified that the player had committed a double murder. The E-rank cooking set items were used together. The boy received 1 point of divine power, while the cooking set items were downgraded to F. Hidden quest completed. Get 10 kills in the Coliseum. Jihan got 5,000 achievement points. He thought he got everything he wanted. But unfortunately, this was not enough. He needed something more substantial. The young man's eyes lit up with excitement when he saw one of the inscriptions on the system's screen. An epic quest that was not given in the Bronze League. Among the spectators of the Coliseum, you had to find the Queen of Shadows and provoke her. Reward: 50,000 achievement points. The interest of the constellation Queen of Shadows. The absolute being. The representative of the star and the divine creature in BattleNet. The constellation's interest meant that it would become a sponsor for the player, helping them gain abilities that were otherwise impossible to obtain. Something that could only happen in the Diamond League. This task must be completed at any cost. If one constellation can be lured to one side, then others will become interested. But will Jihan be able to find what others can only dream of? This will be especially difficult to do in a crowd of ubiquitous and hated elves. These creatures looked at people unfavorably, even aggressively. Like marble statues, they sat in separate stands from the rest of the spectators and pierced the users with their gaze. Jihan took first place, and now everyone in the Coliseum knew about his record 10 kills. They moved the show to show Yoon Se-jin, and the news spread throughout the community. This brought the guy about 10,000 subscribers and 4,000 regular viewers who were part of the Sword King fandom and hoped for Sun Jihan's defeat, became his supporters. And it was no surprise to anyone that all the anger was now directed at streamer Golden Light, who was defeated by a Bronze League player. Commentators saw that Jester had filmed Jihan's murders and was promoting him through his streams, and he was thinking hard about how to increase his reputation. Getting up from his chair, the streamer stretched. Loosening his stiff muscles, he decided that he couldn't do anything about the current situation. From now on, he will also be on Song Jihan's side. The guy has a new fan. Golden Light dreamed of becoming Jihan's editor and making his BattleTube popular. Sia, dressed in funny pajamas, sat with her eyes wide open, excitedly asking what she had just watched. Jihan, not having time to take a sip of water, looked around in surprise because his niece was interested in when he managed to become so strong. The girl shook her head, saying that she felt sorry for the others, while her uncle noted that the world was a cruel competition. She noticed that many viewers wanted to donate to the player. Sun immediately opened this option on the system panel. She also suggested raising the minimum amount since Jihan decided to open a fundraiser. Then the guy decided to set the minimum to 10,000 points of equipment. Sia was amazed at someone else's appetite because it was equal to 1,000,001. Then I thought, maybe it really wasn't enough after all. But Jihan's thoughts were occupied only by the epic task. He must find and provoke the Queen of Shadows. But it was still difficult to figure out how to find her among so many viewers. The guy was pulled out of his deep thoughts by his niece's cheerful voice offering help. She noted with a smile that her uncle always had that expression on his face when something wasn't going according to plan, so it was worth telling her everything. Jihan smiled back, absent-mindedly thinking that the girl looked so much like her mother, his sister. Shrugging his shoulders, he decided to give her a chance and see how she handled it. Sun told about the epic task and answered his niece's questions. Surprised by the strangeness of the task, Sia enthusiastically decided that she would find the Shadow Queen by rewatching the game. Jihan left the room, his conscience immediately tormenting him because of his request for help. After all, it all looked like looking for a needle in a haystack. But he was still proud of his niece. The girl sincerely wants to help, so all that remains is to thank her for it. Returning to his room, Jihan decided to do what he had been putting off for a long time. He already had one class, support, Now the system asked if the player wanted to add another one. The guy bought an extra seat for the class with the points he earned. Now he could choose another one. Smiling contentedly, Jihan extended his finger to the desired inscription on the screen. He firmly decided that he wanted to add a mage class to his support class. At that moment, a purple funnel began to form around the guy's figure. A new power, different from the divine, was coming from his heart, and it was clearly felt. Now, after some time, it was necessary to try out a new class. The reason for this choice was hidden in a unique stat that only appears after obtaining these two classes. The strength stat was the player's desired prey, a small purple ball slowly appearing on Jihan's open palm. In his past life, he had a conversation with an important person while drinking. While drunk, Baron Williams kept saying how sad he was that the guy had gotten citizenship a little earlier. The guild leader would have recognized him as an American and treated him better. That day, after saying they would become closer, Baron shared something unusual with his protege. The man took another sip of whiskey and used his other hand to lift the bottle into the air using red energy. He started talking about strength, abilities, and was surprised when Jihan did not understand what he was talking about. Williams talked about strength, the stat that comes with the perfect combination of divine power and mana. Smiling drunkenly, the man, looking into a glass of ice, said that it was not easy to reach such a level. Others could not do it. He was the only player with two classes. Only the guild leader can have power, since he has two windows of status, support and mage. Such was the gift of Baron SSS rank. As it turns out, there is another condition. You need to have 10 or more points of divine power. Jihan asked again if he could get something similar, but Baron shook his head condescendingly, repeating with emphasis that no one else except him had two classes. The man acted ignorantly, but Sun did not dare to argue. It was true that only Baron had the power to dominate space, but that was the case before. And now, knowing the conditions, Jihan decided to take a desperate step at the cost of his own health. An incredible energy, stronger than the Bronze League, seemed to tear his body apart. This stat propelled Baron to the top spot in the world rankings, despite his poor development and control of it. Jihan must get it in order to cope with the test in the future. He must endure. It is necessary to concentrate divine power in the hands and direct mana from the heart there, uniting it with it. It was important to concentrate so that nothing would slip past. Sun clenched his teeth, holding the sphere in his hand with all his might. His eyes were bloodshot, delighted by what was happening. Jihan muttered something, looking at his hands. The space was illuminated by bright red flashes. A deafening explosion threw the player back somewhere. Jihan hit his head painfully against the wall, unable to hold back a scream. As it turned out, he was thrown back against the door when the guy slid down a few seconds later. Breathing was still difficult. Jihan rubbed the back of his head, closing his eyes. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't just hold them with his hands. Leaning back against the wall, he took a deep breath, thinking that he should have increased his mana reserves, since they were used up after the first attempt. Looking at his own palm, the player doubted whether he would be able to combine the two energies in his hands, because holding them was definitely not an option. A crazy thought struck his head. Would he really have to do this forever? Jihan jerked to his feet, ignoring the nagging pain in his head. The player decided to calm down and think logically, to help himself in a difficult decision. Let's say, if there is no need to hold the force, especially if it is not so tame, what happens if you put it into your own body? Take the divine power that originates in the upper dantian and combine it with the mana of the middle, holding the layer of the lower one while they mix. Taking the ideal shape, you can try to compress them in this state. The sphere, surrounded by other particles, grew larger and burned even brighter. Jihan closed his eyes tightly, sweat trickling down his face from the strain. The player's deafening scream filled the room, a red stream of energy bursting out from his body. The system announced that Jihan was trying to unite the three Danyatians. The danger was great because the player had exceeded his limit and a threat to life was detected. Sia, who was calmly listening to music on her headphones, jumped when she heard some noise coming from the side. The girl watched the game with fascination, looking for the Queen of Shadows, but she could concentrate more on the matter, turning away from the table. Combining the three Dantians, Jihan tried to merge the divine power and mana together to use the power. I also subconsciously added another combat power to them. But the conditions for combining the three Danyatians are very strict. It is necessary to be able to use each of them perfectly. They had their own distinctive nature, and the stats had to be at least 100 points. If a person is far from this level, then when trying to unite the three Danyatians, there is a chance of losing his life. Saya screamed in fear and pulled the headphones out of her ears when she heard a heartbreaking scream coming from her uncle's room. She dashed down the corridor asking what had happened as she went. The girl, beside herself with horror, abruptly opened the door, imagining the most terrible pictures. She fell silent, staring in surprise at the basin of ice water on the floor and the towel. Jihan sat leaning against the bed and put a wet towel on his burning forehead, saying that he was screaming from a headache. Sia asked suspiciously why he felt better so quickly, and the boy replied with a chuckle that the human body was incredibly amazing. The niece expressed discomfort, covering her face with her hands. Sun immediately apologized because he didn't want to anger her. Sia wiped away the tears that had appeared from the recent tension. She was really scared. She thought that something bad had happened to her uncle. Jihan looked at the girl with confusion. He was inattentive. It was worth thinking about Sia. Still not removing her palms from her face, she tried to calm down, asking again and again if her uncle was okay. He awkwardly scratched the back of his head and looked down, assuring her that there was no need to worry. Looking at the player again, Sia sobbed again, wiping the moisture from her eyes. A few seconds later, she burst out laughing and punched the guy in the chest with all her might, screaming that she wasn't worried because he himself said that everything was fine. He bent over from the blow, muttering his gratitude, and Sia went on to look for the Shadow Queen. And even though Jihan's head was still splitting, he would never show his weak sides to his niece. The unification of the three Dantians failed because the guy had a low level and did not have enough points. The towel from the basin suddenly rose into the air, radiating furious energy. Clenching his fist, Jihan cried out in victory. He had received the power after all. After the fusion, divine power and mana are replaced by the unique stat strength. 3 Dantians could not be combined, but the fusion created strength. Jihan was surprised by the inscription on the screen. The connection was weak, and the PowerPoint was too strange. There were 12 of them from the start. The combat strength and strength stats interact and share their value. This means that if one stat is pumped up, the combat strength increases by 2 points, and the strength points also increase due to the interaction of the forces. Jihan even felt embarrassed for a moment, wiping the sweat from his forehead. What he saw was a pure deception. The fact that he has strength is already very good, but how effective will the 3 combined Dantians be? Realizing that he was completely tired, the player decided to leave this issue. If he tried to do it at the current level, he would definitely die. He got what he wanted anyway. It was time to try out the mage's ability. Raising his hand, he opened his palm and called for fire. A small flame immediately appeared in the air. The system immediately announced that the player did not have enough mana. He smiled weakly. The full moon seemed to be watching the user's unfortunate outcome and chuckling. Finally, after this long, difficult night, the sun rose over the city. It ran gently across Jihan's face, making its way through the half-open curtains. The guy didn't feel rested. He just muttered discontentedly that it was already morning, and immediately received a notification that 10 points of divine power had been added. As it turned out, he couldn't absorb divine power from D-rank sacred items and below. He had to use C-rank divine items and above. Yawning, Jihan glanced at the hand acupressure device and the game ball. Fortunately, they were cheap. He managed to buy them with glasses. He decided to sell the rest at the second-hand market, then went to Sia. He called the girl, asking if she was awake, but received no answer. A few minutes later, he saw his niece, who obviously had not closed her eyes all night. Sun was struck by Sia's appearance, and she replied that she had been persistently watching replays of the game, and her efforts were not in vain. Sia pointed her finger at the screen when Jihan leaned over the laptop monitor with a frozen heart. This was a fan video. There were people who got the zoom as a gift. They only film representatives of other species. For Jihan, it was very strange that people would use such an amazing gift for secret filming. His niece immediately distracted him from his thoughts, urging him to take a closer look. A replay of Jihan's fight was broadcast. The commentator pointed to a group of elves, noting that they had very clear skin without any imperfections. The 2 elves sitting on the thrones looked like high-ranking elves. Among them was one drow. The title of queen would suit her. She should be the Queen of Shadows. Sia turned to her uncle with a smile, asking what he thought. The guy praised her for a job well done. But still, the player doubted to himself that the constellation could be found so easily. The girl promised to watch videos from foreign channels. She even made an edit video especially for her uncle. Jihan was surprised that Sia knew how to edit, and she replied that she used to make videos from her father's games for fun. Hearing this, the guy froze in surprise. He immediately narrowed his eyes, using an unkind word towards Yoon Se-jin. Straightening up without removing his hand from the back of the sofa where Sia was sitting, the player turned his head towards the portrait. Even through the broken glass, this man looked at his relatives mockingly, left his daughter alone, a real infantile bastard. 2 days earlier, when Park Yun-sik came to the family, he assumed that he knew the Sword King's girlfriend. It was Ito Shizuru, the owner of the SSS rank gift. Unparalleled beauty. Jihan exclaimed that Yoon Se-jin might have fallen in love with the girl because of this ability. And Yoon-sik said that the department thought so. And now the player suddenly remembered this person, looking at the Sword King. Something similar has happened before. It is not the first time that rising Korean stars have taken Japanese citizenship. If this gift has no limits, she can switch to another player at any time. Since that day, Jihan has been searching for information about Ito Shizuru, a woman of incomparable beauty. Unfortunately, the search has not yielded any results so far. Japan must be hiding her identity. Now it's impossible to find anything. As manager Pak said, "You need to be extremely careful." The player turned his back to the window, deciding that he needed to prepare in advance. If he was right, the opponents had already begun to act. The Japanese self-defense forces had already arrived in Korea. Sia, dressed in a business suit, was a little nervous as she asked her uncle how much longer they had to wait. Looking at his watch, Jihan replied that he was almost ready because they might be late. Both felt great, ready for new achievements that awaited the family beyond the threshold of the house. Jihan straightened the collar of his jacket, grinning as he said that it was time to greet the guests. The elevator descended slowly, passing the 32nd floor. The uncle asked his niece if she was nervous, noticing her thoughtful look. The girl shuddered. After the incident with her father, this would be her first appearance in public. Jihan hastened to reassure her. He asked Seiya to be confident and brave, because there was no need to think about what others would say. The Song family had done nothing wrong. The niece forced a hesitant smile and nodded to herself. Several bells from the elevator alerted passengers that they had arrived at the lobby. No matter how much C tried to calm herself down, she still couldn't contain her emotions in front of the open elevator door. Jihan told her in a barely audible voice that many already knew what they were going to say. As soon as they both had time to leave, a respectable man turned to Jihan, saying that everyone was waiting for him. All the guy's requests were fulfilled. He smiled, thanked, and asked to make sure that the event went well. Manager Park Yun-sik didn't answer, but simply nodded in response. He admitted that at first Jihan's request caught him by surprise. He hadn't expected at all that Song would want to put the Sword King's collectibles up for sale. But now the idea is clear, so the auction of the former Sword King, Yoon Se-jin's favorite items and other belongings was organized. The manager asked if this was necessary to attract Japan's attention. Jihan confirmed his guess. He specifically chose such lots. They need Yoon Se-jin's connector and the data stored on the server. Japan will certainly try to take possession of them. Perhaps something unexpected will happen. The owner of the items may secretly enter the country and interfere with the auction. But whatever he does, citizens will be forced to face reality and realize that they have no choice but to accept it. Park Yun-sik took a new look at this seemingly simple-minded guy, thinking that he seemed to see the future. Jihan added that this was their last chance to change the public's mind and asked the manager to ask reporters to keep an eye on the Japan Self-Defense Forces table. Suddenly, loud shouts were heard in the hall. Someone was calling Sia by name, calling her relatives, but the security did not let them in. The girl turned around and shuddered when she saw her aunt and uncle. The richly dressed woman called Sia a madwoman who stooped to holding an auction. She immediately switched to Jihan, calling him a swindler who had the audacity to sell someone else's inheritance. Seiya firmly stated that it was her relatives who were thrown out because they used her father's name to deceive people. The uncles and aunt were stunned and froze, seeing such a harsh rebuff from their always submissive niece. The girl asked if they thought she was stupid, the one who couldn't see who was actually looking at her father's money in his absence. Sia said that now all of her father's things are hers, and only she has the right to decide the fate of the inheritance. Turning sharply, she demanded that security remove her relatives, who did not belong there. Jihan looked at his niece with admiration, calling her cool, and she proudly threw her hair out of her face, saying that she could stand up for herself. The manager opened the heavy doors and informed the family that they had arrived. Sia and Jihan walked straight onto the auction stage and were already noticed by reporters. The savvy journalists immediately turned on their cameras and flashes, ready to capture the sensation. Jihan glanced at the crowd with indifference when he heard them ask him why he was holding the auction. Seiya was also attacked, claiming that her decision to give up the Sword Palace and hold an auction was provoked by public pressure. As the girl and boy walked towards the podium, reporters pounced on them, asking if they believed the Sword King would return and if Song was trying to profit from a relative's property. Jihan got tired of this pretty quickly, and unnoticed by the others, he gathered bloody energy in his palm, then made a circular motion with his fingers. A few seconds later, the lens of one of the photographer's cameras burst, scattering into small pieces on the floor. Then the same thing happened with the cameras of other reporters. The crowd looked at the equipment in a daze, not understanding what had happened. The player, reaching the podium with a microphone, asked the crowd to be quiet, because they were at an auction, not a press conference. Finally, straightening up, Jihan, with his characteristic confidence, announced the start of the auction. His men prepared 3 lots. The first was Seijin's BattleNet connector. It reduced the feeling of pain by 99%. The data stored in it remained intact. Also present were Seijin's analyses of himself and high-ranking East Asian players. Those present began to discuss the lots. The data of the King of the Sword is very valuable, and the analyses are incredibly useful when the battle between Korea and Japan is approaching. Jihan looked at the people sitting at the tables and grinned imperceptibly. They would not want to miss a single lot. The analysis from a high-ranking player is not easy to get. Suddenly, the guy noticed that someone's hand confidently reached up. The player was stunned when he saw who exactly wanted to ask the question. Takeda Kazuo, the recruitment manager of the Japan Self-Defense Forces, a plump man, was smiling, and next to him stood a girl, looking askance at Jihan. Takeda, twitching his gray mustache, slyly asked if he could offer a price since the auction had already begun. He offered $5 billion for all the lots, which caused a natural reaction from the others. The man added that he would like to request a personal meeting with Song Jihan and Yoon Sia. With his hands in his pockets, the player approached Kazuo, asking him to say whatever he wanted to say. This is not the time or place to accept an offer to meet, as Japan knows firsthand. The interlocutor shook his head, replying that he was scared by the guy's gaze, especially since the man was a guest, and the host should have been more welcoming. If he shows his hostile attitude, someone will have to intervene. After these words, the young girl in 2 steps appeared at Jihan, putting the hilt of the katana to his head. It was Kazuo's bodyguard named Shadow. She couldn't be compared to Keno, but she was also an amazing player who could do a lot. The man pretended to be worried, saying that he was in no way threatening, but simply keeping me informed. A glimmer of divine fire appeared in Jihan's eyes, and he was amazed at how similar the warrior was to Yoon Seijin. They didn't take a single step to the side, just like Shadow, who continued to stand nearby. Thin fingers gripped the katana with force. The girl was ready to strike at any second. A shadow appeared in front of Song Jihan, and he fearlessly attacked it. The next second, something happened that no one expected. The player forced Shadow to fall back with one blow. The girl dropped the katana from her left hand, although she held onto the other one. She lowered her head, clenching her teeth in impotent rage. A bruise from the blow had already begun to bloom on the delicate skin of the bridge of her nose. Shadow suddenly felt an incredible force coming from her opponent. Just as she was about to pull out the tip of her katana, Jihan put his hand on Tenny's shoulder, advising her to abandon her plan, since the auction was being broadcast on his BattleTube channel all over the world. Does the girl really want to bare her blade in front of the audience? Takeda Kazuo's expression suddenly changed, and he waved his hands, calling on everyone to calm down. He rose from his chair and began to bow to Jihan and apologize, saying that his bodyguard was rather hot-tempered. The man raised his eyebrows, telling the boy that they needed to discuss something. He is ready to pay $5 billion, taking into account a personal meeting. Jihan frowned and Sia screamed when Kazuo insisted that the Sword King's daughter answer the offer. The player was at a loss for words when such a claim was made to his face, since the property of the national hero belongs to his relative. The man put his hands behind his back and slowly walked next to Jihan, noting that the auction was actually being run by a girl. He was getting closer and closer to Sia, saying as he went that he wanted to meet her in person, since she was clearly interested in where her father was now. It was truly a forbidden move. Sia cowered in front of Kazuo like a small animal in front of a predator. Her interlocutor calmly straightened his bow tie, saying that he could be asked about everything, and he himself had a lot to tell. Raising his small, cunning eyes to Sia, he asked what she had decided. Seeing the confusion in the other person's eyes, Kazuo rubbed his hands, thinking that the girl would definitely agree, because such an offer could not be refused in a sane mind. The man's face took on a truly incredible expression as Sia loudly announced that she refused. Now he looked at the girl in bewilderment, starting to stutter, not believing that Sia was refusing $5 billion because of the need to meet in person. The girl replied that her uncle was right, and if her father could only be contacted on his terms, then she did not want to know anything about him. Sia smiled, stating that she was a minor, so she had to do what her uncle said. Jihan thought it was a complete relief. He thought all the items would go to Japan. Even though Sia declined a personal meeting, it is unknown what else Kazuo can offer. The man fell silent, replying that nothing could be done, and Jihan thought that he had given up. But the Japanese man suddenly beamed and exclaimed that he was still offering 5 billion. The offer of a personal meeting was optional, his own whim. The player was angry listening to this deception, but Takeda took something out of his inside jacket pocket, saying that he had received orders from the very beginning to offer money. Smiling widely, he placed an envelope with the seal of the Sword King on the table. Then Sia said that this letter was personally for her, written by her father. He asked again if they had come to an agreement, and the girl bit her lip, not knowing what to do. On the envelope there was a seal with a flower, and the name written Ito Ryuhei. Unable to resist, Seiya picked up the concerto, and Kazuo happily turned to Jihan, saying that it was too easy to get the Sword King items, and didn't the Korean BattleNet have 5 billion? The man spread his arms, deliberately mocking the player, singing as the auction ended quickly. Jihan recalled that the recruiting manager of the Japan Self-Defense Forces in his past life was banned from entering America, and he was good at recruiting foreign players, which earned him the nickname Japanese Disaster. Now, confident of his impunity, Kazuo clasped his hands together, offering Seiya to sign the contract right now. Jihan thought that the man must be directly related to the player who uses the incomparable beauty. This was a man to be wary of, especially since Japan had received all the items too easily, as if the participants had agreed on everything in advance. It would look bad on screen. Those present were indignant. Why did they come at all? It was pointless. 5 billion from the very beginning. But all was not lost yet. We just had to turn the momentum around. At that moment, Sia entered the game. She began to read a letter from her father into the microphone, which stunned everyone. He wrote that his daughter's decision to give away the Sword Palace was a real shame because it was the last thing left of him, and the property should have been managed wisely. And finally, this is the end of the relationship between father and daughter. Let Sia not expect anything more from him. The guests invited to the auction began to whisper loudly when they heard the cruel words. Wiping away stinging tears from her eyes, the girl forced a smile and said that it was his handwriting, and this is what her father wrote. Jihan turned away, physically feeling the pain of his niece's betrayal. From what he heard, the woman was of incomparable beauty and knew how to influence the mind. He hated Yoon Si-jin from the beginning, but to see he was a good and reliable father. He couldn't do this to her. A loud sound of paper being torn in half was heard through the speakers. Sia, in a low voice as she tore the letter into pieces, told Kazuo to convey the following words from her to Mr. Ito. His daughter read his last will and was glad to end their relationship. The scraps of paper fell to the floor. Sia pretended to be upset and said that she shouldn't have shredded the letter. Now the cleaner would have to work harder. But at that moment the pieces began to rise upward, circling around the girl's face. Jihan declared that everything was fine. He would take care of it, and with one movement of his hand he lifted the paper into the air and it headed towards the shining sphere. The boy clenched his fist, summoning fire, and the pieces of paper burst into bright flames right in the air. Like so many phoenixes, they blazed and immediately turned to ashes. The rest of them opened their mouths in silent surprise. The auction participants were amazed by the player's possession of both combat techniques and divine power. Jihan stopped using energy and immediately heard an admiring cry. Kazuo's face shone brighter than the sun. A man like this was needed in Japan. He didn't immediately realize that a whole crowd had rushed towards the player, leaving him far behind. Representatives of various guilds vied with each other to offer Jihan to join them under any conditions. He looked at the business cards, raising his hands up, asking them to wait because he was uncomfortable with everyone crowding around him. He stepped back, deciding that now was not the time to talk about such things. Jihan heard his niece's weak voice. She said that her uncle could go without her. The girl seemed to be suffocating. Beads of sweat appeared on her face, and she began to babble something. Sia grabbed her head, almost falling off her feet. She muttered that her head hurt too much. The next moment, the niece moved to the side and fell to the floor. Jihan froze in horror for a second, forgetting about everything in the world. His dear relative lay on the stage and did not move. Jihan ran up to the girl, lifting her in his arms and begging her to open her eyes. When Sia woke up, she was mumbling something as the guy kept asking her if she was okay and urging her to hold on. The girl was clearly trying to say something to her uncle and grabbed the collar of his jacket. Pressing herself against Jihan, Sia whispered in a completely calm voice that she was pretending. The girl thought that it would be difficult for her uncle to cope with the guests, so she played along. While they were negotiating, the security quickly pulled the crowd aside. The guests were indignant. Now they wouldn't be able to place a bet. A puzzled Jihan looked at his niece with wide eyes, admiring her intelligence. He shook his head, sadly noticing how much his daughter resembled her mother. The guy turned to the guests, asking for forgiveness for the auction ending abruptly because his niece felt ill and needed rest. Supporting the girl who was diligently playing her role, Jihan loudly asked if she could go on her own. Kazuo persistently tried to get through to the young people through security. He asked for forgiveness for the inconvenience his visit had caused them. Pointing to his business card, the man invited Jihan to greet him personally and asked permission to contact him personally. At that moment, the business card flew out of his hands with a whistle. Jihan just laughed at the man and instantly burned the piece of paper in the air. The player held out his palm and menacingly announced that this was his answer. Commentators could not believe that the bronze player had rejected such an offer, while the manager stood silently, clenching his fists. He straightened his bow tie again, smiling strangely, muttering that Jihan was the best. The unknown force that can tear a business card to shreds is real. He deserves it even now, being only at the Bronze League level. Kazuo must get his hands on this rising star at any cost. Meanwhile, hidden from prying eyes, Jihan gave his niece a high five. He praised the girl for her excellent acting skills, and she brushed her bangs from her face, replying that she was good at everything she did. The player froze when he heard from the system about an unread message. He read the notification. It said that he had a sponsor, who even with the broadcast turned off sent 10,000 equipment points. The writing style was similar to Takeda Kazuo's. While the uncle and niece were talking, Lee Hae-young blocked their way and greeted the family. They froze when the woman said she was glad to meet them. The head of the third department wanted to greet the guys on behalf of the Divergent Guild. The woman smiled, asking for forgiveness for the sudden visit. She really wanted to meet them. Jihan was not at all embarrassed. He only asked how she came here without an invitation. Hae-yeon openly said that she had good connections with the Korean BattleNet department, and she used them. The player was surprised to hear the revelation that at work, the head of the third department was known as a spoiled child. This confidence, shamelessness, and tone of voice were definitely familiar to him. Their owner extended an elegant hand. Looking closely at the woman, Jihan saw a completely different figure before his eyes. That one from his past life, a sly woman in a mask and revealing outfit, coquettishly said that she was his fan. He looked at the head as if enchanted. Sia cast a questioning glance at her uncle. She did not understand what had happened to Jihan, who was silent, and blinked her eyes in surprise. Turning her gaze to Lee Hae-young, she shuddered, deciding that the guy had fallen in love with the stately woman opposite him. The player said that in everything there is a line beyond which it is dangerous to cross, because once you cross it, it is impossible to turn back. The head and her bodyguard were stunned when they heard a quote from the writer Dostoevsky, who was known for his gambling addiction. Lim Guyan frowned and became angry as she looked at Jihan. Unable to hold back, Plum Blossom Sword pushed her mistress back with her hand and stepped forward. The woman almost threw herself at the guy, asking who he was and how he knew Lee Hae-young's motto. Only a couple of people knew that the lady was a real gambler. No one from outside could know about it. Jihan smiled, realizing that there was no longer any doubt. This woman's nickname was Zero, and she was the manager of America First. The only Korean besides him, this scoundrel was always drinking and gambling, but became the guild's deputy thanks to the capabilities of her voice, an ability that is used for amplification. After finishing the training, when people pay attention to pumping other aspects of stats and gift ranks, she reveals herself in a new light, and the strongest was she, Zero. Continuing to smile, Lee Hae-young gritted her teeth and ordered Gayun to shut up. Jihan thought that the guild was doing well, and he met Zero on one of his previous broadcasts. What she wrote in the chat was imprinted in his memory, so he decided to clarify. The guy apologized for catching them by surprise. Lim Guyan was surprised that her mistress was also writing in the chat. She didn't know what to do with herself from embarrassment. The woman coughed, feeling awkward at being suddenly called a gambler. Jihan thought with a smile that this was a fact, and Seiya, looking at him, was sure that he really liked the chapter. Lee Ha-young smiled and shook her head, saying that she didn't mind talking in a more casual setting, and that they would see each other often in the future. Sia covered her mouth with her hands when she saw the guild leader take out his phone. She must have really liked her uncle. She confidently handed over her mobile phone, offering to meet in person since the Divergent Guild needed the guy. Sia almost squealed with delight, painting in her head the rosy prospects for the development of her uncle's relationship. Lee Ha-young fixed her hair, thinking that she was good and was good at setting the tone of the conversation while separating business and personal relationships. The woman glanced at Gayun, showing with her eyes that she needed to learn. This is exactly how you should manipulate men. The atmosphere changed. The air seemed to be filled with the scent of flowers coming from the flirting Lee Haeyeon. Jihan sheepishly apologized, replying that he still didn't know his phone number. Both women froze in shock when they heard the answer to all their efforts. The guy turned to Sia asking what her number was, causing his niece to look confused. Sia suddenly decided that her uncle was playing the prude. She thought that Jihan was up to something and needed help, so she pretended to feel bad again. Jihan told the women that his niece was not feeling well and that they had to go. Haeyeon held out her business card with trembling hands, and the player promised to use it to contact the guild leader. When everyone left, Sia was proud of herself. Now she didn't have to worry about her uncle's relationship. Hayoung turned to his bodyguard, who was trembling slightly. The woman saw that Gayun was overwhelmed with emotion and was barely holding back the laughter that was bursting out, and she ordered her not to hold back. Uncontrollable laughter echoed through the corridors, and the head of the guild grumbled something in response. Jihan was brought out of his thoughts by his niece's question. She noticed that something had come as a big surprise to her. With a smile, Sia noticed that her uncle was wearing his father's suit. The player shrugged. His own had already become too small. He straightened his jacket. The guy noticed that the suit was not to blame. Sia nodded. If it suited her uncle, then everything was fine. She suddenly added that Jihan's answer was simply terrible. He looked at the girl in surprise. She shook her head, saying that it was too old-fashioned and tasteless. The "I'm the first one to reject you" tactic has been around since prehistoric times. While Jihan didn't understand what was being discussed, Sia mentored him by saying that you can play hard to get, but saying that you forgot your number is terrible. The player was lucky that his niece was nearby and saved the situation, but she was incredibly surprised to hear that he had not planned anything like that. The hand with the index finger extended hung in the air. Sia asked incredulously if this was true. Jihan nodded. The next task in BattleNet involved moving to the Bronze League in the territory of Gangnam. The task type was protection. It was necessary to protect the crystal and survive the zombie attack. Moving into place right in the suit, Jihan shook his head wearily. He remembered how difficult it had been to calm Sia down that evening. The girl immediately burst into tears, deciding that she had ruined her uncle's chance for a relationship because of her stupidity. Did his niece really think that he liked Lee Haeyeon? Who would pay attention to a gambling enthusiast? Still, he hadn't expected to meet Zero under these circumstances. In a past life, he was sitting in a bar and watching a sports match where Argentina's Diego Maradona won. Jihan became close to Zero because they both lost their homeland, and on weekends they bet on sports. The woman was obsessed with them. The player's victory upset and angered Zero, but Jihan knew that he would win. He advised her to pay attention to the rank of the gift God t-shirt, but the woman did not listen to him. Jihan advised her to stop playing games, but she just waved her hand. Then she said her motto, that very quote from Dostoevsky, and it really irritated her. Sun asked if Zero was going to get rid of the scar on his face. The woman pressed the mask tighter, answering that it was the price for the deal with the devil. The couple had a lot in common besides sharing the same nationality. Zero asked why Jihan became strong only now. If she had been as strong in the past as she is now, she would have stayed in Korea, and then her friends wouldn't have died. So what united them most was guilt and self-hatred. The woman shook her head drunkenly, saying that she had no right to say that it was all her own fault. Both felt guilty for failing to protect their loved ones. Jihan looked at the amber drink in his glass, wishing he could drown in it and not feel anything anymore. Now he looked at the bloody sky in the game space, remembering these moments. Commentators watching the game were puzzled as to how long the player would remain standing there. In Jihan's right hand was a sword that pierced the horse, Pontiff Urk, an alien sacred object. The guy was curious why it was so cheap despite its rank, but it turned out that it was because it was too big and heavy for most people. Jihan decided to try the dagger in action and swung it widely. Then, raising the weapon above his head, he swung. It wasn't difficult for Jihan to handle such a blade. The user heard strange voices asking him to show the status window. The ground shook as a huge weapon descended upon it. The number of spectators grew, and they began to ask questions about the origin of his power. 12,000 people were already looking at the player. Jihan didn't know if he should show the window, but it would be unwise to ignore the request of regular viewers. It was worth deciding whether to answer directly or lie. Finally, the guy took a deep breath and addressed his viewers directly, greeting them and introducing himself. If they are so interested in his status window, the player will show it when he gets 200,000 subscribers. That was his promise. Commentators began to complain that such a number would not be reached anytime soon, but Jihan decided to add one more condition. If he loses even one game, then he will immediately show the window. The audience didn't expect this, But everything would have changed if the guy had met the troll. Jihan gripped the hilt of his blade even tighter. Blue beams appeared behind him, signaling the arrival of his teammates. The guy turned around sharply, raising an eyebrow. The players that appeared were not the ones he expected to see. It was simply impossible. Golden Light, Argentina player Diego Massid, and the hated Kim Gyo-hyuk. The jester theatrically wiped a tear from the corner of his eye with a handkerchief, exclaiming that fate itself had brought him to Song Jihan. The fire mage turned red with anger, clenching his teeth, threatening to kill the player with one look. Jihan met the Argentinian in person for the first time. Diego Massid seemed oblivious to everyone as he continued to play with the ball. He was Argentina's best player until Tsihan's return in time. But now he was nothing special, and besides, he looked vulnerable and stupid. Suddenly the guy thought about something, realizing that it was strange. If he himself is a support, Golden Ray is a warrior, and that disgruntled third one is a mage. Could it be that the football player here was an archer, considering that in his past life he had the mage class? Jihan couldn't even imagine what had happened. Meanwhile, Gahuk was terribly angry when he met his offender. Because of him, he lost his ability, and now he didn't even want to see. A system board appeared in front of the magician's face. Someone registered a reward for the task. Gahuk was surprised that such a fool could give him such a thing. He was completely taken aback when he read that he was offered to destroy the crystal and prevent Jihan from taking first place. A few seconds later, the game began, and Masida's sword flew into the face of the first zombie. Without saying anything, he continued to attack the dead man with the ball every now and then, as if he were scoring goals into the goal. Stopping for a moment, the man ordered Jihan to apply enhancements to him, because the archer needed more strength. In a team game, it is important to treat all participants fairly. Previously, the player did not use stats because they were not enough. But now the number of divine power points has increased. You can try. The user called upon the force, and the figures of all team members lit up with a bright blue light. Golden Light clapped his hands happily when he realized that he had also been given a buff. Jihan turned out to be a real support. Gohyuk was puzzled as to why Jihan supported him when he addressed the boy. Looking over his shoulder, the player asked if he was going to play for the first time. The same jester jumped up to them, wondering what had happened between them and whether they were both friends. The magician muttered what would happen. Then Jihan nodded to him, satisfied with the answer. Declaring that he relied on his team, the boy took off and jumped from the tower, asking for the blade to be placed on his shoulder. The trio looked down in confusion as their support disappeared from sight. Masid pointed down, asking if Jihan was crazy, and the magician immediately called him a stupid football player who didn't understand anything right away. Kim Gye-hyuk hated the player. Does he really think that his teammates are subordinates? The wrinkles on the guy's forehead smoothed out. He decided that he would do what he decided for himself. Jihan rushed into the thick of the living dead. The zombies growled and stretched out their half-decayed hands towards him. A fireball appeared in the player's hand. He was about to attack the enemy with pure fire. The mana and divine power, which became more powerful after the fusion, will tear this gathering of zombies apart. Jihan's eyes turned white, and the fireball turned into a powerful sphere. It turned into a real hurricane that descended to the ground. With his power, he swept away the living dead like paper dolls. Jihan pushed himself off the wall and extended his hand with a dagger. Then he rushed forward and raised the weapon above his head. The tip pierced one of the monsters, but the enormous power of the weapon splashed out to the sides, increasing the effect of the force. The zombies, who were at a great distance, began to melt from the fire. Masid and Golden Light leaned over the edges of the tower, calling the Korean support crazy. Enemies died in a matter of seconds, and it was all broadcast live. The audience discussed the guy with admiration, not understanding where he came from. As if from nowhere, a bloody zombie rushed at the player, screaming deafeningly. The hideous face grunted and snapped its sharp teeth, trying to reach the user. Jihan stood in front of him and thrust his blade into the ground. He smirked at his thoughts. Everything was going as the player thought. It was not in vain that I had to endure those torments. That is the true value of the ability to control space. A bloody sphere appeared above him, and the two zombies, absolute territory. Anyone who enters it falls under the control of the user. Many people don't know about this ability, but Jihan was personally familiar with it. Baron was poor at control, unlike his abilities, so he often used him as a training partner. Song Jihan fought against the guild master's power quite often. The guy was able to fully study her in that amount of time. From the destroyed ground, the player pulled out a sharp sword with a jerk. Jihan is currently in an absolute state, using both divine and martial powers along with mana. The level of the pathetic Bronze League was no obstacle for him against the fight against the strongest zombies. The number of slain living dead gradually increased, burning in the divine fire. Last time, Jihan couldn't kill 1,000, but now he knew he could do it. There was very little left to get the deserved reward, but it was necessary to move even faster than usual. Song Jihan literally flew above the ground, wielding his blade. My head was buzzing. My feelings were tense to the limit, trying to move only forward. A bright blue light poured from the player's eyes, as if he was blinded by the target. Golden Light and Macid found what happened absurd as they watched the support. The jester noticed that he too was now interested in looking at his status window. Meanwhile, Kim Gyo-hyuk was preparing to carry out the mission. The spectators asked Golden Light to show them the mage, who turned around, calling out to his teammate. The streamer was stunned when he saw what he was about to do. Gyo-hyuk was already standing next to the crystal, apparently preparing to attack it with a fire blast. The rest of the team froze, not understanding what the magician was doing. He raised his head high, filled with hatred for Jihan. Finally, he sent the player to hell with all his might, calling him a rootless scumbag. Jihan froze with a dagger in his hands, hearing these words behind him. The magician, without stopping, exclaimed that in the last few days everyone was looking only at him. All he did was court his niece and manipulate her. Jihan froze, especially hurt by the words about his niece. Kim Gyo-hyuk didn't stop, wondering what the player had done to make the girl obey him obediently. The audience understood that the magician was testing Jihan's patience, because the impudent man even doubted the player's intentions towards his niece.